Hey guys, tonight we descend into the shadowy backstreets of ancient Memphis at the edge of the Nile. The air feels thick with incense smoke and the muted hum of distant worship. You settle onto a worn sandstone bench beneath flickering oil lamps, knowing you probably won't survive this without your wits about you. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Post your location and local time in the comments so we can see where in the world you're tuning in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Then you slip deeper into the labyrinth of narrow alleys, where the neon glow of moonlight dances off painted walls, each surface whispering stories of women whose lives are both legendary and forgotten. The scent of frankincense mingles with the earthy perfume of the river, and every footstep echoes like a secret spoken too loudly. As you weave past stacked crates of papyrus and sealed jars of sesame oil, you notice the faint glimmer of oil lamps dancing across sandstone walls. Courtesans in linen kilts, their eyes rimmed with kohl, slip through hidden doorways that open only for those who know the secret knock. You inhale the warm scent of frankincense and steamed figs, and for a moment you feel like a cat chasing a laser pointer, utterly curious but unsure where it might end. Suddenly you realize you didn't bring extra sandals, but hey, at least you won't need a sarcophagus tonight. One mainstream historical fact leaps to mind. Prostitution is one of the oldest documented occupations, stretching back to around 3000 BCE in Egypt's early dynastic period. You picture scribes recording payments on papyrus rolls, each transaction a testament to a trade woven into urban life and local economies. Historians still argue whether these women acted independently or were largely controlled by temple administrations, and that debate hums beneath every scholar's pen. Fringe whispers suggest sacred courtesans once performed ritual dances in temple courts, more interpretive art than strip show, but rumors traveled faster than festival drummers. Your footsteps echo in a narrow corridor lined with painted reliefs of Hathor, goddess of love and joy. A quick joke crosses your mind. If those walls could talk, they'd probably order a quiet night in. You press on until you reach a low archway covered in crimson drapery. Beyond it, the air grows thick with heated breath and the clatter of coin purses opening. A woman leans against a marble pillar, her voice a soft murmur as she negotiates the next appointment. You catch her scent of honey and coriander, intriguing enough to rival any modern perfume counter. Brokers shuffle around like mischievous mice, balancing clay tokens that represent currency. These courtesans are more than fantasy figures in painted tombs. They run households, manage finances, and cultivate influential friendships. Joke number 2 springs forth. They probably gossip better than any royal messenger. Some even own property or borrow funds from eager lenders, quietly flipping their earnings into dowries or workshop tools. A hush falls as a wealthy merchant enters, his sandals thudding on stone. He offers a disc of silver and slips a folded papyrus to the attendant. Contracts sometimes spelled out the duration and services expected, an early form of booking confirmation. You smirk, because at least now it's easier than calling a mid-level influencer for a collaboration. The real shocker is that certain decrees attempted to regulate these exchanges. Legal papyri detail fines for clients who failed to pay or behave too boisterously, proof that some things never change. Smooth voices and soft laughter echo off weathered brick, while overhead, a single owl hoots a lazy greeting. You glance upward, half expecting to see a security camera, but it's just night settling over the river. You remember that crocodile dung sunscreen you read about earlier, yes? actual dung pressed into a paste to block UV rays. Cute, but questionable. You shiver, though it's just the whisper of the breeze off the Nile. Joke 3. You'd pay good money to see Cleopatra's skincare routine. Caught in the swirl of candles and conversation, you realize this isn't a dusty ruin, but a living city buzzing after sunset. Papyrus scrolls, clay lamps, and silver rings all glint in the lamplight, creating an atmosphere more captivating than any stage production. That fringe practice about erotic chants, probably embellished, yet some texts hint at celebratory hymns greeting new clients in temple courtyards. Historians still argue whether these were genuine rituals or later imaginative additions by Greek visitors. You tuck that mystery away for later pondering as you drift deeper into the scene. Scrawls on broken potsherds, known as ostraca, reveal scribbled insults and coded messages aimed at specific women like graffiti that feels more petty than rock concert scribbles. You half expect to see a hashtag but find faded hieroglyphs, each telling you someone's reputation could rise or fall on a joke carved in clay. In some districts, you stumble on small shrines dedicated to gods like Bes and Tauret, where clients might deposit a token of appreciation after a night of companionship. Those clay figurines and trinkets form a peculiar mix of personal gratitude and public display, an early review system if you squint hard enough to call it that. Your heart thumps softly as you retreat along a narrow back alley, the chant of the city and the secret world of courtesans melding into one hypnotic melody. You carry with you the scent of jasmine oil and the echo of whispered negotiations, a world hidden behind painted walls and secret thresholds. And as you follow the cool night breeze toward the riverbank, you understand why these stories have endured for millennia and why we're barely scratching the surface. The moonlight glints on the water as you wander back to your starting point, a quiet sentinel among the ancient stones. This first glimpse behind the veiled doors of Egyptian pleasure quarters sets the stage for revelations tomorrow. You may not survive unscathed emotionally speaking, but who wants a dull bedtime story anyway? Now slip deeper into your pillow and get ready for what tomorrow holds. The night is young and our journey is just beginning. You wake before sunrise, the horizon a faint glow behind papyrus reeds, and follow the Nile's whisper as it carries you back through time. The earliest signs of organized companionship appear around 3000 BCE in Egypt's early dynastic era, where pottery fragments and graffiti hint at women offering paid company alongside grain and pottery sales. You imagine bustling river ports near Abydos and Hierakonpolis, stalls laden with salted fish and fresh figs, while women in linen kilts negotiate their own bargains. You probably think modern dating apps have it rough, but these pioneers managed without a single smartphone swipe. As the first traders paddled in from the delta, they encountered more than spices and textiles. Scribes carved lists of payments on clay tags, detailing sums of barley or silver debon exchanged for time and conversation. One mainstream historical fact anchors this scene. The term Heset surfaces in early hieroglyphic inscriptions to denote a woman who received compensation for her companionship. You picture clay tokens clinking like ancient casino chips, each one a promise of warmth in a world still learning courtesy. Historians still argue whether these arrangements were purely economic or deeply ritualized in temple precincts. Some fringe whispers suggest that Heset also described women performing ritual dances for Hathor in temple courts, an early form of ceremonial entertainment that blurred the lines between devotion and desire. You picture lithe figures moving beneath pillars carved with feline goddesses, their music echoing off sandstone walls in a performance part prayer, part private show. You meander past mud-brick dwellings where courtesans lived alongside boat builders and fishwives. They managed their own households, traded surplus grain, and sometimes lent silver to hopeful artisans. That level of financial savvy might put your budgeting app to shame. A quick joke flits through your mind. If they could track expenses in barley, you have no excuse for missing a utility bill. In narrow alleyways, you spot charcoal sketches on plastered walls, crude portraits of favoured clients, etched alongside symbols of fertility gods. Some claim those images served as irresistible advertisements. You recall that crocodile dung sunscreen you read about in the last section, and wonder if these women use similar inventive cosmetics to turn heads under the scorching sun. The scent of roasted chickpeas drifts in the air, a reminder that life then was never far from basic necessities. Trade caravans from Syria and Nubia arrived at fortified docks, carrying incense, ebony, and unfamiliar olive oils. Foreign merchants sought more than Egyptian gold. They sought companionship with women renowned for their beauty rituals and storytelling talents. You chase a mental image of a Nubian trader attempting to pronounce Hesed, mangling consonants while hoping for an unforgettable evening. Jokes about linguistic missteps bubble up, because trying to haggle in broken Egyptian might feel like asking your barista for oat milk with a British accent. Legal fragments discovered on broken pottery shards reveal early regulations. Official decrees set fines for clients who failed to deliver promised goods or who trespassed beyond agreed boundaries. Some courtesans held contracts that granted them immunity from certain civic duties in return for their services at public festivals. Historians still argue whether these regulations protected women or simply codified control by powerful temple administrators. The debate feels as heated as a baker arguing over the price of new loaves. You step into a small courtyard where women gathered at dawn to collect water and share gossip. They traded news of wealthy patrons, compared jewel tones of new makeup concoctions, and quietly planned improvements to their houses. Imagine a medieval salon, but without velvet drapes and with far more linen. One fringe tidbit claims that some courtesans owned cattle herds used for dowries, a fact that would confuse anyone who thinks ancient sex work was uniformly impoverished. It seems resourceful clients sometimes gifted livestock instead of coins, leading to barn door negotiations you would gladly document on Instagram. By mid-morning, the city swells with merchants, scribes, and officials, and courtesans slip discreetly into workshops or seek schooling in reading and writing. A surprising number maintained literacy, enabling them to draft their own agreements or correspond with distant relatives. You pause to admire the ingenuity, joking that they probably had better handwriting than your last text message. Their homes doubled as meeting places and schools of cultural exchange, turning each encounter into a microcosm of urban life. As the sun climbs higher, you pause beneath a date palm for shade and consider the broader implications. Paid companionship in this era functioned as an economic engine, stimulating pottery production, linen weaving, and even carpentry for private chambers. Women who mastered negotiation contributed to local prosperity beyond mere personal gain. That scholarly debate drives in again. Historians still argue whether economic motives outweighed social bonds in shaping these early practices, and you feel the tug of uncertainty beneath every argument. The fragrance of baked bread and new papyrus scrolls drifts toward you as craftsmen load goods for river transport. You chuckle at the thought that these courtesans helped fill merchant holds, their earnings circulating back into the system in a cycle as reliable as the Nile floods. Joke number 3. At least they had a stable currency. You can't even rely on your airline points. As the day unfurls, you realize the origins of Egypt's pleasure industry were neither simple nor shameful, but woven into the fabric of urban life. These women combined entrepreneurship, artistry, and social savvy to carve out spaces of autonomy. Their early ventures laid the groundwork for centuries of evolving practices, proving that human ingenuity thrives even in the humblest of beginnings. You flick a pebble into the river and let the ripples merge with your thoughts. You slip through sandstone pylons into the heart of Karnak's temple precinct, just as torchlight flickers across carved hieroglyphs. The air smells of incense and desert dust rising from the courts where priests chant hymns to Amun. Somewhere between the columns you hear whispers that some of these sacred spaces doubled as pleasure quarters. You probably think temple life was all solemn rituals, but rumor has it certain courtesans mingled with worshippers after hours. So, before you drift too deep, remember to keep your sandals on tight. One mainstream historical fact grounds your wanderings. No surviving Egyptian text explicitly describes temple prostitution within precincts dedicated to deities. Papyrus records and inscriptions honor priests and priestesses but remain silent on any sanctioned sexual rites inside temple walls. That silence speaks volumes under the relentless desert sun. Historians still argue whether later Greek travelers like Herodotus misinterpreted Egyptian practices or whether the Egyptians intentionally concealed those aspects of worship from official records. Despite the lack of direct evidence, fringe whispers persist that women known as swant performed nightly dances in front of Hathal's sanctum. These dances supposedly combined erotic movement with ritual blessings, a blend of devotion and desire that blurred boundaries. You imagine gauzy linen swirling around slender limbs, the soft jingle of ankle beads echoing through shadowed corridors. It sounds more like a modern performance art piece than a Bronze Age ceremony, but curiosity keeps you pressing on. As you follow a narrow passage lined with lotus and papyrus capitals, you notice faint red ochre stains on the floor. Some say those marks come from spilled wine during after-hours banquets for select devotees. Others claim they are merely centuries-old paint flakes weathered by wind. A quick joke crosses your mind. If those stains could talk, they'd probably demand their own Netflix special. Either way, the atmosphere feels charged with secrets. You pause beside a carved relief of Bes, the dwarf god who protected households and childbirth. Fringe theory holds that Bes's cult may have tolerated more liberal practices in peripheral shrines, far from the watchful eyes of temple administrators. You raise an eyebrow because mixing fertility rites with frolic isn't exactly what you'd expect from a stony cold stone ceiling. Yet the practical Egyptians were nothing if not inventive when it came to securing divine favor. A low murmur reaches you from beyond a hidden doorway. Inside, a small chamber glows with oil lamp warmth. Painted walls depict dancers offering garlands to the goddess Tefnut. One fringe tidbit claims those dancers were paid companions lending sexual services under the guise of ritual offerings. You smile at the idea of ancient happy hour disguised as sacred ceremony. Joke number 2. At least they had better party planning than your average event coordinator. Step by cautious step you enter, noticing the faint aroma of honey mixed with lotus incense. You might think that's an aphrodisiac cocktail, but it's probably just the standard Egyptian perfume formula popular across social strata. Still, the idea of perfumed passages leading to hidden chambers sets the imagination ablaze. You imagine dignitaries slipping secret notes to each other on folded papyrus while sipping date wine, an early version of seductive text messaging without screens. Suddenly, you catch a glimpse of a contract fragment inside a weathered wooden box. This papyrus snippet outlines payments not to temple priests, but to unnamed women for unspecified services. Mainstream scholars point out that such contracts more likely reflect private commercial arrangements outside temple oversight. Yet the language uses terminology often reserved for sacred offerings. Historians still argue whether those phrases indicate ritual homage or merely poetic marketing meant to reassure clients of divine protection. You run your fingers over the box's carved lid, feeling the grooves where artisans once etched symbols of Ma'at. It strikes you how the concepts of order and justice might have been applied even in clandestine settings. Perhaps those contracts served as moral safeguards, promising fair treatment and confidentiality. After all, confidentiality feels as modern as encrypted messaging app, but evidently had ancient precedents. A distant flute melody drifts through the corridor, blending with the near-eye silence that only night in the desert can bring. You think about the many sunset ceremonies held in these halls and wonder how many invited guests stayed for private celebrations long after the public rites ended. Fictional accounts dramatize temple beauties luring unsuspecting pilgrims, but real evidence remains frustratingly scarce. That uncertainty sparks your scholarly curiosity even as your eyelids grow heavy. One quirky rumor suggests that temple dancers used lotus-infused oils to induce mild trance states in clients, a form of spiritual anesthesia meant to heighten sensory perception. You stifle a laugh because the only thing you want to be anesthetized from right now is your to-do list. Yet the notion of ancient aromatherapy as part of erotic worship doesn't seem entirely improbable in a culture so devoted to scented garlands and perfumed ointments. As you navigate a side chamber decorated with turquoise inlays, you feel the smooth coolness under your palm. Temple walls served multiple functions. Some rooms stored ritual equipment, others housed sacred barks, and perhaps a few offered secret hospitality. Trying to map function to space feels like playing historic Minesweeper, but with higher stakes. Joke number 3. You'd pay good silver deben just for a floor plan. Finally, you emerge back into open air, the sky ablaze with stars unfiltered by city lights. The temple's vast pylons tower above you, silent witnesses to centuries of worship and whispered scandals. You sense that the true story lies concealed behind layers of official silence and exuberant rumor. Sorting fact from fiction feels as challenging as unwrapping a mummy's linen wrappings without tearing the bandages. Historians still argue whether those rumors of saintly courtesans were ever more than creative storytelling by foreign visitors. You turn toward the Nile's soft murmur, feeling the cool breeze carry away the temple's charged energy. The boundary between sacred and profane remains as elusive as the horizon where sky meets water. Your mind drifts with the current, settling into a state of gentle wonder. Tomorrow, you'll probe further into everyday realities beyond these sensational legends. But for now, you slip through a low-set mud-brick doorway into a hidden courtyard where courtesans begin their day long before sunrise. The scent of freshly pounded barley mingles with the earthy aroma of clay ovens heating up in corner niches. You notice woven mats laid out to dry under a wooden trellis draped in grapevines that cling to damp walls. Small oil lamps flicker at strategic points, casting shifting shadows. You move silently so as not to disturb an attendant stirring pots of spiced lentils for a midday meal later on. One mainstream historical fact anchors this glimpse into private quarters. Legal papyri from the New Kingdom record instances where women known to work as paid companions acquired property deeds in their own names. These documents show that courtesans could buy, sell, or lease homes independent of male relatives. Historians still argue whether such transactions reflect genuine female empowerment or simply technicalities in a patriarchal legal system. You follow a slender corridor lined with wooden shelves holding clay jars of olive oil and rosewater. Courtesans manage these ingredients themselves, overseeing brewing of date beer and mixing herbal poultices. A quick joke drifts through your mind about how their apothecary skills rival any modern-day skincare influencer. You imagine them stirring fragrant blends while negotiating the next client visit. A fringe tidbit floats to the surface of your thoughts. Some local storytellers claim that certain courtesans kept trained monkeys who retrieved messages or fetched fresh linens from nearby weavers. These tales might be fanciful, but you can see why a playful primate would add novelty to evening receptions. You picture a small monkey draped in a gilded collar scampering after a clay cup of wine. Appointments are scheduled at a low wooden table under a lattice window overlooking a narrow lane. You notice scribes, their reed pens poised over ostraca, jotting names and times in neat columns. Clients paid in silver deben or sacks of grain receive tokens marked with the date and a numeric code. You smirk, thinking that at least they had an early form of a booking confirmation system. A group of women gather at another table, balancing clay tokens like traders counting coins. They record daily earnings, then decide how much to set aside for linen purchases, household repairs, or dowry contributions. Each choice reflects an impressive level of financial planning. You crack a joke about how their budgeting spreadsheets would shame yours. Scholarly debate hums beneath these activities. Historians still argue whether the ability to manage money translated into broader social freedoms or remained confined within certain elite circles of city life. That unresolved question adds a layer of intrigue to every financial record you glimpse. You wander into a small reception room where the walls are painted with scenes of papyrus blooms and falcons in flight. A courtesan greets a visiting merchant and leads him to recline on a cushioned bench studded with coloured beads. She offers him a cup of honeyed wine and reads his pulse with delicate fingers. You note how rituals blend hospitable gestures with carefully choreographed intimacy. Assistants move quietly, carrying trays of fruit and bowls of fresh water for washing. They polish brass mirrors and adjust the position of reed blinds to control light filtering in. You realize that these women oversee a modest household staff of 2 or 3 attendants who help maintain order so they can focus on negotiation and performance. The clatter of a reed floor instrument drifts in from an adjacent room. A dancer practices a slow, rhythmic routine, while another courtesan tunes a small stringed lyre. Music in these homes accompanies private gatherings built around art, storytelling, and companionship. You joke that this private concert outshines many public festivals you have seen. By midday, shadows shift, and you step into a sunlit alcove where gourds of water rest on stone pedestals. You observe women discussing loan arrangements with local lenders. Some borrowed silver debby to expand their quarters or purchase new linens. Those debts were recorded officially, then repaid with interest over several months. You pause to imagine negotiating interest rates with a stern-faced moneylender. A gentle breeze ruffles papyrus mats overhead as you consider the broader picture. These courtesans functioned as micro-entrepreneurs who managed households, staff, and finances. Their mastery of logistics and negotiation provided unexpected agency. You reflect on how modern career coaching might draw lessons from their organizational savvy. You move toward a small doorway draped with dyed linen curtains. Beyond lies a workroom where courtesans exchange news of upcoming festivals and new clients. One woman leafs through fresh orders of scented oils, while another inspects recently woven textiles. You smile at how these domestic scenes blend artistry with commerce in ways that transcend common assumptions. As you slip back into the courtyard, you feel the pulse of daily life behind closed doors. The careful balance of hospitality, craft, and fiscal management reveals a world far richer than any simple stereotype of ancient sex work. You tuck these observations away. You slip through a narrow side alley and find yourself standing before a low mud brick structure tucked between a grain storage warehouse and a busy tavern. The scent of freshly baked flatbread mingles with the tang of fermented date wine drifting from the courtyard beyond an open doorway. As you step inside, you notice clay tables piled with sealed jugs of beer and baskets of onions, olives, and dried figs. This is no back alley bordello, but the beating heart of a bustling economic engine. You probably think those women simply earned coins and spent them on trinkets, but their earnings fueled entire supply chains without which daily life would grind to a halt. A mainstream historical fact anchors this scene. Ptolemaic papyri from Alexandria record specific taxes levied on brothel profits, indicating that authorities recognized sex work as a reliable revenue source as early as the 3rd century BCE. You can almost hear the clack of reed pens tallying earnings and calculating remittances to the treasury. Historians still argue whether those taxes primarily supported public granaries or filled the coffers of temple treasuries, leaving room for spirited debate among scholars. You step past a low wooden counter where an attendant seals small clay tokens into a leather pouch. These tokens represent fractions of a deben, the standard unit of silver weight, and served as receipts, ensuring clients could claim promised services or negotiate refunds. Fringe whisperers insist that some brothels accepted livestock instead of metal one-ostracan fragment, supposedly lists goats, geese, and even honeybee hives as acceptable payment. You smirk at the image of a goat nibbling on a reed mat in exchange for companionship, but the notion shows how inventive commerce could become when money was scarce. As you move deeper, your eyes adjust to the dim glow of oil lamps hanging from wooden beams. A pair of weavers sit on woven mats, stitching linen sheets that will soon cover padded benches in private rooms. Their nimble fingers loop threads with practiced ease, and you realize without these artisans there would be no hospitality. You joke that these brothels had better interior design teams than most of today's boutique hotels. Linen weaving, pottery production for lamps, and carpentry for folding screens all depended on steady orders from these pleasure quarters. You wander into a side chamber where jars of perfumed oils line low shelves. Courtesans and clients alike used these scented unguents to mask sweat and stale air. Some exotic imports arrived from Byblos and Punt, including cedarwood oil and frankincense. Small vials of these precious substances changed hands like modern luxury cosmetics, creating demand that stretched across the Eastern Mediterranean trade networks. You laugh at the thought that ancient influencers probably bragged about their signature scent just as loudly as any celebrity today. Beyond the perfume stand, you find a cluster of potters molding clay into miniature oil lamps. Each lamp bears a unique stamp indicating the brothel owner's mark, a way to trace tax payments and guarantee quality. You imagine a pottery workshop operating with near-industrial efficiency, churning out hundreds of lamps weekly to meet demand. Joke number 2 comes to mind. If those potters had a Kickstarter page, they would hit their funding goal by sunrise. In a tiled courtyard adjoining the workshop, small livestock pens hold goats whose milk becomes an ingredient in cosmetic creams. A confident goat bars softly as an attendant leads it past stacked baskets of barley and dates. Some fringe stories claim these goats were pampered with honey and pomegranate peels to improve milk quality. You picture a line of goats sporting little collars and wonder whether they enjoyed the attention as much as their human counterparts. You step toward a heavy wooden door, leading to a larger hall where local fishermen deliver baskets of fresh fish each afternoon. Their catch forms part of the standard meal offering for clients and staff alike. You note that brothel kitchens acted like any communal eatery, with cooks weaving together offerings from market stalls. The busy hum of commerce rings in your ears. Every fish sold here meant less for the general populace, but more coin for traders and cooks. At a low, arched window, you observe a group of merchants haggling over grain deliveries. These women and men negotiate amounts, prices, and delivery schedules. The courtesans depended on a regular supply of barley and wheat to feed their households of assistants, musicians, and security personnel. A quick joke flits through your mind. They probably had better logistics software than your favorite delivery app. You wander past a silversmith hunched over a workbench, hammering thin bowls used for bathing rituals. These bowls accompany private ceremonies designed to relax clients after a long day under the hot sun. The silversmith's hammer rings clear in the courtyard, and you wonder whether he prefers working for brothels or royal households. Either way, these commissions provided steady work and allowed him to reinvest in tools and apprentices. In the heart of the structure, you find a small accounting office where scribes tally daily profits and plan expenditures. Clay tablets and papyrus scrolls bear entries for linen, oil, pottery, and food, alongside payments from clients. You pause to marvel at how meticulously these records were kept, joking that modern businesses could learn a thing or two about old-school bookkeeping. Beneath the dusty ledgers lies an open question. Historians still argue whether these financial records reflect widespread literacy among courtesans or merely savvy administrators operating behind the scenes. A gentle breeze drifts through an open doorway leading to tiny stalls where cobblers repair sandals worn by courtesans and clients. Leather scraps and reed fibers litter the workbench, while the smell of heated hide hangs in the air. Each sandal must be durable enough to withstand gravel courtyards and riverbank promenades. You smirk because even ancient footwear needed a good cobbler, much like your favorite pair of sneakers demands modern repair. As afternoon light shifts, you sense the ripple effect these brothels created across the city. Workers in distant workshops, traders on Nile barges, and farmers in outlying fields all depended on this demand for goods and services. The walls of a brothel might look shabby from the outside, but measured in emerald oil vials and freshly spun linen, it was a mini metropolis unto itself. You realize that in a world before banking, these pleasure quarters were economic powerhouses quietly driving markets. You step out into the late afternoon sun, feeling the heat radiate off sun-baked bricks. Jokes about overpriced lounge bars and trend-driven nightclubs cross your mind. But the ingenuity of ancient networks feels far more impressive. Courtesans and brothel owners were entrepreneurs ahead of their time, cultivating supply chains and stewarding resources with entrepreneurial flair. Their impact on local economies stretched from pottery kilns to vineyard plots upriver. As shadows lengthen, you follow the gravel path back toward the Nile, each footstep echoing the idea that no industry exists in isolation. The economic engines you uncovered today reveal a world where commerce, pleasure, and survival were tightly intertwined. You consider how modern societies still wrestle with similar questions of taxation, regulation, and social welfare for service industries. With a final chuckle at the image of goats as currency, you turn your gaze to the river's gentle flow, ready to drift toward tomorrow's revelations about the myths and realities woven into the lives of ancient Egyptian courtesans. You push open a low wooden door into a narrow chamber lined with clay jars and polished stone pallets. The air carries a faint perfume of rosewater and almond oil that clings to your skin. Flickering oil lamps cast golden pools of light on shelves, packed with small bowls of powdered pigments and containers of scented unguents. You move slowly, so you don't disturb the delicate balance of stacked bottles. A calm hush settles over the room as you inhale traces of frankincense drifting from a nearby brazier. One mainstream historical fact anchors this ritual space. Archaeologists have uncovered cosmetic palettes dating back to the Naqada period around 3500 BCE that contain compartments for pigments, now known to be red ochre and green malachite. These palettes were used by both men and women to apply makeup as part of daily grooming and religious practice. Historians still argue whether elaborate makeup was a symbol of social status or simply a practical response to harsh desert light. You reach for a small bowl of henna powder, meant for nail and hair dyes. Skilled hands mix it with water or oil into a dark paste that stains nails a deep crimson shade lasting days. You imagine courtesans' fingertips glowing brighter than any modern nail art trend. Fringe whispers claim some women added ground snail shells to their henna to create a pearlescent finish, a trick more alchemical than cosmetic. You grin at the thought of ancient snail shell highlighter it would give your last manicure a run for its money. Next, you lift a container of green malachite dust. With a tiny reed brush, you sweep it across your eyelids and under your brow, creating a bold line that contrasts against sun-bronzed skin. This eye makeup was believed to protect against glare and ward off infections. A quick joke crosses your mind about how these natural eyeliners lasted longer in desert heat than any waterproof formula you've tried. You inspect a jar of powdered galena used to darken eyelash tips and deepen the kohl around eyes. The soot-like pigment sometimes contained lead, which we now know was toxic in high doses. Courtesans trusted it to sharpen their gaze. You pause thinking how they probably outlasted your favorite waterproof mascara in a rainstorm. Then you uncover a sealed clay pot holding a curious mixture of crocodile dung and ox fat. Rumor has it this paste served as sunscreen, blocking harsh UV rays while leaving skin smooth. Texts in the Eber's papyrus include recipes for mixtures of animal fats and plant oils for skin protection. Historians still argue whether crocodile dung actually provided any genuine protection, or if the reference is a later exaggeration by Greek observers eager to exoticize Egyptian customs. You stifle a laugh because you'd pay extra to find a modern sunscreen that promises the same mystical edge. Along-one wall jars, labelled in faded hieratic script, contain imports from Punt and Byblos. You see vials of cedarwood oil, bowls of ground frankincense resin, and sealed flasks of pressed rose petals. These luxury ingredients arrived by ship and caravan, traded like precious metal. Joke two flits through your mind. Ancient beauty influencers probably bragged about their signature scented blends just as loudly as any celebrity today. You notice a low shelf where assistants keep bronze spatulas, small wooden sticks, and reed brushes used for precise application. Courtesans seldom handled raw pigments themselves. Dedicated cosmetic servants mixed batches each morning and evening, ensuring consistent texture and hue. You imagine a team of assistants working like an early cosmetics counter, free of modern makeup brushes but no less meticulous. Under a slanted window, a stone basin holds cool water for washing off old layers of paste and pigment. Courtesans removed heavy makeup by moonlight, using linen cloths dampened with rose water. You feel the cool steam rising as you imagine the gentle ritual of cleansing after a long day. The soft hum of the Nile outside feels like one continuous lullaby. As you trace your finger over a polished alabaster jar lid, you sense the importance of appearance in social interaction. Beautiful skin and striking eyes were tools of persuasion as much as any skill in conversation. Joke 3 whispers in your mind that at least their skincare line never needed influencer endorsements to sell out. You pause to reflect on the broader implications. These beauty rituals reveal a culture that valued sensory, luxury, and practical protection. Women with access to these mixtures crafted a personal image that blended artistry, health, and social signaling. Each pigment and ointment tells a story of trade networks, medical knowledge, and cultural values woven into daily life. You step out into a courtyard fragrant with jasmine and feel a breeze that carries traces of sandalwood and crushed violet petals. The jars and pallets you leave behind hold secrets of refinement and resilience. Your fingers still carry a hint of crimson stain as you wander toward the next chamber, ready to uncover more ways courtesans shaped their own power through the art of appearance. You enter a dimly lit chamber, carved into the rock near the tombs of Beni Hassan, and find yourself surrounded by dusty scrolls, ceramic ostraca fragments, and the low murmur of scholarly debate. The air smells faintly of papyrus pulp and dried mud brick as 2 scribes lean over a carved limestone bench, arguing in hushed voices about the meaning of a single hieroglyph. You settle onto a rough-hewn stool, ready to witness how experts wrestle with evidence that refuses to speak clearly. One mainstream historical fact anchors this dispute. Despite thousands of surviving inscriptions from the Old Kingdom through the Ptolemaic period, no Egyptian text explicitly names a woman as a professional sex worker, illustrating how the documentary record cloaks this practice in silence. Historians still argue whether this omission reflects cultural modesty or deliberate erasure. You feel the weight of that absence pressing in, like the hush before an important confession. On one side of the room, a grey-bearded philologist gestures at a fragment of papyrus. She insists that the term pernetta in certain temple accounts refers to women employed in ritual companionship, blending service and worship in a single phrase. Across from her, a younger archaeologist shakes her head, insisting that pernetta simply denotes temple property, not people, and that reading human agency into real estate listings distorts the evidence. Fringe whispers add spice. Some enthusiasts claim that a rare ostracon, showing a reclining figure with lotus flowers alongside a seated male porter, is graphic evidence of clandestine assignations. You chuckle inwardly because it sounds a bit like spotting a bikini in a family photo album and assuming there was a wild beach party. You inhale the cool breeze drifting through a narrow slit in the chamber wall. Flickering oil lamps cast dancing shadows on chipped murals, one showing elegant women holding mirrors and another depicting clappers used in festival processions. Some scholars argue that the mirrors symbolize self-reflection and status, while fringe theorists interpret them as secret signals between courtesans and clients. Historians still argue whether those mirrors invited clients to private chambers or simply belonged to elite women attending temple feasts. You wonder if modern makeup tutorials are any less cryptic. A voice from the back of the room rises in excitement. A papyrus economist points to tax records from the Wilbur papyrus, noting how temple estates list revenues from perishable goods, yet make no direct mention of payments for companionship. She contends that the absence of explicit listings indicates that priests treated sex work as part of broader hospitality services rather than a distinct category. Another expert retorts that absence of proof is not proof of absence, and that scribes may have used code words to conceal socially sensitive transactions. You grin because you remember that crocodile dung sunscreen rumor and recognize how code words can travel faster than certainty. You feel a gentle vibration in the rock underfoot as the Nile's distant pulse hums through subterranean passages. The senior epigrapher passes around shards of limestone engraved with faint hieratic script. One shard displays what might be a client's name, followed by a symbol resembling a small lotus blossom. She insists the symbol marks membership in a women's guild of performers, while her colleague argues it denotes ritual service in fertility rites. Fringe historians have even proposed that these symbols represent a secret code for brothel locations, a poetic twist on treasure maps. You stifle a laugh because treasure maps tend to be more reliable when X marks the spot. A slender assistant brings a tray of date wine in reed cups. You sip the sweet liquid and join the conversation. One researcher speculates that when Greek historians like Herodotus and Strabo wrote of sacred prostitutes in Egypt, they were misreading their own cultural assumptions onto foreign customs. Another counters that Greek accounts, though biased, cannot be ignored, and that they hint at practices Egyptians chose not to record for posterity. Historians still argue whether Greek testimonies best illuminate or distort the true nature of Egyptian companionship. You quip that relying solely on Greek bloggers might be like trusting every travel influencer's beach review. Your eyes drift to a faded wall painting showing women in flowing kilts offering garlands to a seated deity. Some interpret this as devotional gesture. Others see an erotic undertone meant to secure divine favor. The debate feels as nuanced as reading tea leaves in a storm. You trace the outline of a female figure's lips, and your mind wanders to how subtle shifts in pigment could change an image's meaning entirely. Fringe theory suggests that hidden underlayers of pigment revealed by ultraviolet scans show erotic scenes erased by later overseers. You shake your head at the idea of ancient Photoshop and imagine a history curator muttering about version control. As dusk filters into the chamber, you notice a slender scroll tied with braided linen. The epigrapher unrolls it to reveal a list of temple donors and what they offered: cereals, oils, and personal services. One line reads simply, "When the goddess hungers," a phrase some argue is a euphemism for sexual offerings. Others insist it refers to symbolic feeding rituals. Historians still argue whether that phrase marks the point where ritual hospitality tipped into erotic territory or remained strictly ceremonial. You bite your lip because you know how nuance can hang on a single word, much like a well-placed comma changing a legal contract. You lean forward as the debate turns to iconographic analysis of statues found at Komombo. These statues depict women holding sistrums and lotus flowers. One side contends these were professional musicians and dancers, not courtesans. Others counter that performance and companionship were inseparable in Egyptian social life. Fringe enthusiasts have even pointed to the decorative base of one statue, claiming its pattern encodes secret meeting times. You chuckle and think how event invitations today use group chats instead of hieroglyphic riddles. A mild hush falls over the chamber when a young historian unveils infrared images of tomb paintings. The scans reveal faint outlines of intertwining bodies, once thought to depict divine unions. She argues they represent early erotic art connected to fertility cults, while skeptics warn that infrared artifacts often mislead and that pigment degradation can create shapes where none existed. Historians still argue whether these infrared shadows hold clues to actual practices or are simply pareidolia playing tricks on our modern senses. You feel a thrill knowing that ancient walls still guard their secrets fiercely. A final flourish of debate erupts as the scribes examine a handful of ostraca graffiti from workers' villages at Deir el-Medina. Some inscriptions scrawl crude jokes about nightly visitors and reference women by nicknames that sound scandalous today. One fragment reads, "Nefertiti's belly laughs last longer than river floods, and sparks giggles across the room." Experts pass the humour for hidden meanings. Was this casual mockery of popular courtesans or evidence of community acceptance? Historians still argue whether village graffiti reflects widespread attitudes or isolated jests among artisans. You smile because humour across the centuries binds us together more than dry legal texts ever could. You rise from your stool as the debate winds down, the oil lamps guttering as candles burn low. The arguments haven't yielded a clear verdict, yet you appreciate the richness of the scholarly tapestry, threads of text, image, and rumour woven together with cautious interpretation. You pat your sandal-clad foot on the stone floor and offer one last thought out loud. Ancient academics probably never expected an audience member to challenge them mid-lecture, yet here you are doing just that. You step out onto the cool stone terrace and gaze across the desert night, the stars winking like distant patrons waiting for their turn. The debates you witnessed underscore how our understanding of Egyptian courtesans depends as much on modern perspective as on ancient evidence. Sorting fact from fiction feels like teasing apart threads in a tightly woven tapestry. Historians still argue whether the evidence will ever fully reveal the truth or leave us forever chasing shadows. You inhale the night air, your mind buzzing with possibilities, and prepare to follow tomorrow's path deeper into the world where myth and reality intertwine in fractal complexity. You settle at a low wooden bench inside a faded archive room where papyrus scrolls and folded letters lie in neat stacks beneath glass vitrines. The air feels cool and slightly musty as you lift the lid of a clay jar marked with thin, looping hieratic script. Inside, you discover bundles of private correspondence tied with linen thongs, each one a whisper from a world that rarely spoke aloud about intimate commerce. Your fingertips brush faded ink lines as you unwrap the first note, and you feel an uncanny connection to a woman who once gripped this very papyrus in her own hands. One mainstream historical fact tethers your excavation. The famous Papyrus Teptunis 2.614, dated to around 250 BCE, contains a legal contract between a woman named Apollonia and a client named Ptolemaios for 30 nights of companionship at a fixed rate of 1 silver deben per evening. This document outlines payment terms, confidentiality clauses, and remedies for breach of contract. You smile because at least now you know your favorite subscription service fees are ancient too. Historians still argue whether these contracts reflect the norm among professional companions or represent exceptional cases commissioned by wealthier clients. As you unroll a second slip of linen, you uncover a personal letter addressed to a friend in a neighboring city. The writer confides that she has grown fond of her patron's storytelling more than his silver coins and wonders if affection will ever count as currency. You pause at the heartfelt phrase and imagine scribes clutching quills, hearing rumours of courtesans, also seeking emotional attachments. A fringe whisper suggests that some letters were hidden inside hollowed-out figs to avoid prying eyes, an early version of secret messaging that sounds more novel than any spy movie. Joke number 1 springs to mind because fig-based encryption would have made modern tech support calls more interesting. You run your finger along a clause in another contract, preserved on a narrow strip of papyrus. This one stipulates that if the patron fails to provide wine and incense as agreed, then the woman may demand double payment or terminate the agreement immediately. That feels almost like negotiating hotel minibar perks rather than ancient companionship. You think about how charging for aromatics could give any spa receptionist serious envy. Historians still argue whether local magistrates enforced these terms formally or if enforcement relied on reputations and informal community pressure. A third fragment catches your eye, a scribbled addendum referencing a guarantee of privacy. The scribe notes that witnesses must be present when payments are exchanged, but then must swear never to divulge the details of the service. That evokes an early form of non-disclosure agreement, which you imagine causing modern lawyers to nod appreciatively. Fringe theorists have speculated that some courtesans burned the witnesses' notes afterward to protect client identities, a dramatic twist reminiscent of espionage thrillers. You chuckle at the idea of ancient ink blot tests serving as court evidence. Your gaze drifts to a folded letter sealed with red beeswax. Breaking the seal, you reveal a client's plea for an extension of service, complete with promises of extra incense and a small herd of sheep as recompense. Imagine negotiating rate hikes with livestock instead of bonus points. No wonder modern freelancers envy your negotiation skills. You read that the courtesan politely declined until an additional deben of silver was included. That level of professional boundary setting feels as modern as refusing a group chat invitation after hours. Historians still argue whether clients ever dared contest such refusals or quietly accepted the terms without fuss. You then examine a starkly formal contract written in neat columns on a larger sheet. It sets out allowances for medical support if the courtesan fell ill, including coverage for physician visits and medicinal unguents. That clause reminds you that sex work carried real health risks long before modern clinics and therapists. One quirky rumor holds that some women carried small amulets of bees as talismans to ward off disease, a fringe practice mixing superstition with self-care. You imagine a hamster-sized god statue shielding you from sniffles and grin at the thought of soothing anxiety with tiny deity figurines. A soft breeze drifts in as you arrange the documents back into order. The glow of late afternoon sun filters through a lattice window and casts patterned shadows on the dusty floor. You reflect on how these papyri reveal legal norms that balanced commerce, confidentiality, and personal welfare. These private texts turn courtesans from mythic temptresses into savvy negotiators crafting binding agreements. You crack a joke about how even today you wish your online service providers required handwritten contracts in plant-based ink. That is joke number 3, and it feels perfectly timed. As the room grows quieter, you tuck one final bundle beneath your cloak. This packet contains a scribbled note in a hurried hand that references a dispute over unpaid nights and threatens to take the matter before a local council. The note ends with a plea for fairness rather than scandal. That closing sentiment strikes you because it makes these women feel human rather than historical abstractions. Historians still argue whether the existence of such dispute letters indicates a robust legal framework or reflects a patchwork of community-led resolutions without formal tribunals. You exit the archive room and stand in a narrow corridor lined with painted reliefs of lotus blossoms. The scent of fresh papyrus mingles with incense carried from the temple precincts beyond. Your mind buzzes with fragments of intimate agreements, emotional entreaties, and legalese more binding than many modern subscriptions. You realize how these ancient whispers shape our understanding of agency and risk, in a world where intimacy and economy merged in the papyrus-lined corridors of dusty offices. With the last rays of sunlight guiding you back toward the Nile, you inhale the warm evening air and ponder tomorrow's journey through hidden graffiti and private shrines. Each new fragment adds depth to a narrative woven from contracts and confidences. You tuck the echoes of these papyri beneath your breath like a secret vow, then follow the river's steady murmur toward your next revelation. You step through a narrow corridor hung with faded linen curtains and arrive in the guest wing where the hierarchy of companionship unfolds like a living tapestry. The walls are painted in muted ochre shades with simple geometric patterns marking each chamber's rank. You notice that rooms closest to the central courtyard boast carved wooden doors, recessed alcoves, and polished limestone floors, while those at the back feature rougher mud brick walls and simple reed mats. You probably expect every chamber to look the same, but here even space and decor whisper secrets about status. A mainstream historical fact brings clarity. Papyrus ledgers from Oxyrhynchus dating to the 3rd century BCE record titles such as Lady of the First Chamber, Keeper of the Latticed Window, and Apprentice of the Outer Hall, indicating a formal hierarchy among women offering paid companionship. These designations governed room assignments, fees, and access to the best clientele. You imagine ancient real estate listings, but with seduction instead of square footage. Historians still argue whether these titles reflect official administrative ranks imposed by brothel owners or marketing embellishments created to entice wealthier patrons. One scholar insists that formal contracts reference specific chamber titles, giving senior courtesans both prestige and legal protections. Another counters that such labels merely served as advertising copy, with little real-world enforcement. That debate hums beneath every rumour in these halls. You step into the finest chamber first, a spacious room overlooking the riverbank. The air smells faintly of cedar incense and fresh papyrus scrolls stacked on a small table. Velvet cushions in deep indigo line, the low platform bed, and a carved alabaster lamp flickers in the corner. This was once reserved for the most sought-after companions whose reputation drew high-ranking officials. A fringe whisper claims that the head courtesan, known as the Mistress of the Morning Star, wore a circlet of gold beads to signal her rank, a custom whispered about in hushed market stalls. You smile because an ancient pageant of jeweled hairbands sounds more glamorous than any modern influencer crowning ceremony. Beyond a woven partition, you discover the second tier of rooms labelled Chambers of the Latticed Window. These chambers were slightly smaller, but featured small latticed openings, letting in a cool breeze at dusk. You imagine clients leaning through latticework like secret rendezvous in a medieval romance novel. Assistants collected payments and led clients to these mid-level suites, where junior companions offered conversation and lighter services. You joke that at least they had a built-in air conditioner before electricity existed. Deeper in the wing, you find the outer hall assigned to novices, known as Apprentices of the Outer Hall. These rooms sit adjacent to the common areas where the scent of roasted chickpeas and barley beer drifts in. The decor is simple reed mats, glazed pottery bowls, and basic clay lamps. Here, novices learned the art of hospitality under the watchful eye of senior mentors. A fringe notion suggests that these apprentices wore coloured sashes woven from palm fronds to denote their beginner status. You laugh because the idea of palm-wood frond sashes as a dress code would make any modern starter badge feel quaint. Along the corridor you pass a small antechamber where courtesans gathered before dawn to receive daily assignments. A chalkboard-like slab of slate bears names and room numbers written in chalk hieratic script. An orderly attendant crosses off names as matrons call their apprentices forward. You marvel at the efficient system, a roster reminiscent of a morning call at a military barracks, but with more perfume. You crack a joke that their attendance tracking puts some of today's corporate check-in systems to shame. At the far end of the wing lies a private salon known as the Council of Pearls. Only the senior courtesans could enter this circular chamber, outfitted with cushioned benches arranged around a central brazier. Here they discussed fees, negotiated shifts, and petitioned the brothel owner for privileges such as extended villa visits or shares in profits. A mainstream document uncovered at Deir el-Medina describes a meeting of elder companions deciding whether to allocate part of their earnings toward communal oil supplies or house repairs. Historians still argue whether these gatherings amounted to genuine self-governance or were orchestrated by managers to maintain order. You lean against a cool wall as you watch a pair of women in fine linen robes present requests to a stern overseer seated on a low dais. Their voices are measured and diplomatic, a stark contrast to the hushed giggles you heard among apprentices earlier. You note that senior courtesans manage not only their own schedules, but also mentored juniors in etiquette, music, and conversational arts. That level of professional development surprises you more than any modern vocational school. A quirky rumor drifts through your mind about a secret subgroup known as the Whisper Circle. Legend holds that these elite companions shared hidden messages through coded poetry delivered on lotus petal scrolls. Some fringe historians claim that membership in this circle conferred supernatural insight into political gossip. You stifle a laugh because secret poetry scrolls sound like an ancient Twitter DM, except way more fragrant. The hierarchy also extended to the waiting staff and attendants, whose duties ranged from preparing scented baths to maintaining reed blinds. You glimpse a young attendant kneading dough for midday bread, and wonder how she navigates the courtly codes. The most trusted assistants held the title Cupbearer of Fragrance, responsible for mixing wine with rosewater and jasmine. You joke that they must have had the world's first sommelier, albeit with fewer vineyards involved. Staircases at the wing's center lead down to storage vaults and laundry pits. Some novices pitched in to wash linens while senior companions supervised quality, ensuring threadbare mats never reached clients. You shrug at the thought that linen snobbery is hardly a modern luxury. Behind a grating, you peer into a small basin where assistants scrub clay oil lamps and polish copper bowls. That labor ensured that every chamber glowed with clean light and shimmered utensils, a hospitality level that modern hotels still struggle to achieve. As afternoon shadows stretch across the tiled floor, you pause at a painted relief depicting a woman presenting a folded cloth to a robed man. Some interpret this as a ceremonial investiture of rank. Another fringe theory contends it shows the awarding of a new title after years of service. Historians still argue whether these depictions reflect actual promotion ceremonies or are symbolic illustrations of divine favor. You grin because nothing says workplace hierarchy like a promotion ceremony in painted form. You exit the guest wing through a small courtyard where perfumed fountains bubble amid low benches. The water's cool hiss contrasts with the warm scents lingering on your skin. You reflect on how space, titles, and ritual ceremonies woven through these brothels created a structured world. Women navigated this framework to gain autonomy, resources, and social leverage in ways both subtle and profound. You quip that even today some industries could learn a thing or two about layered leadership from these ancient entrepreneurs. With that thought, you step back into the main hall where the murmur of mingling voices carries on, a living testament to a carefully ordered ecosystem of pleasure and enterprise. The next corridor awaits, promising more revelations hidden in frescoed walls and secret alcoves. You inhale deeply, then follow the scent of incense toward tomorrow's discoveries. You step onto a creaking wooden platform at the edge of a bustling river quay, where Nile barges from Nubia, Phoenicia, and the Aegean moor side by side. The scent of salted fish mingles with coconut husk, smoke, and foreign spices brought by traders whose languages tangle like reels of gourds beneath your skin. You slip through the crowd where merchants exchange ebony, cedar, and copper ingots, while courtesans move among them like graceful shadows, keyed to hidden rhythms. You probably think ancient travel was all sand and sandals, but here the Nile feels more like a superhighway of culture and commerce. A mainstream historical fact anchors this cosmopolitan scene. Archaeologists have found Greek amphora shards stamped with Egyptian hieratic inscriptions at Ptolemaic dockyards, indicating that Hellenistic merchants frequented local pleasure houses alongside standard trade transactions. You can imagine scribes fluent in demotic and coin, Greek tapping out agreements on papyrus for evening companionship priced in silver drachma rather than deben of silver. Historians still argue whether these amphora stamps served purely fiscal purposes or doubled as loyalty tokens for favored clients. You drift past a group of Nubian traders whose laughter rumbles like distant thunder echoing off mud-brick walls. They speak in rolling tones you barely catch, but recognize as kin to the desert wind itself. A Nubian courier offers a courtesan a string of rare blue faience beads and a flask of honeyed wine from his home tents south of Aswan. Fringe whispers suggest some Nubian patrons wore leopard pelts and used ivory combs during their nocturnal visits to signal status and attract attention. You chuckle at the idea of nocturnal safari chic, outdoing anything you might see at a modern club opening. You press a clay token into the hand of a Greek merchant wearing a chiton-dyed indigo and embroidered with gold leaf. He offers a wry salute and mutters a few words you catch only as fleeting phonemes. You imagine the language barrier could be as hazardous as a crocodile lurking under the pier, yet courtesans learned key phrases in half a dozen tongues to ensure smooth negotiations. Joke one flickers through your mind because being multilingual in that era is more impressive than your own attempts to order pizza in a foreign city. Beyond the quay, you glimpse a small courtyard where Persian envoys recline on low mats and sip rosewater laced with crushed saffron. Their long robes drape around bronze incense burners emitting a sweet musk of burnt sandalwood. These envoys exchange polite compliments through interpreters in exchange for company that goes beyond mere conversation. One fringe rumor claims that envoys occasionally staged mock diplomatic ceremonies with courtesans acting as honorary dignitaries to cement alliances. You smile because international relations work differently when treaties were sealed over shared wine cups. You wander under a vine-draped trellis where carved pillars depict foreign deities like Baal and Astarte carved alongside Egyptian gods. Courtesans adorned in layered linen skirts thread beads into guests' hair or braid fragrant jasmine crowns around their temples. You imagine weaving flower garlands was a ritual opening act before shifting into more private entertainments. Joke too springs to mind about modern brunch DJs knowing a thing or two about ambience but lacking skills in plaiting jasmine crowns. At a low marble table you see an Assyrian caravan leader counting silver rings and folded papyrus scrolls. He glances over and offers you a friendly nod before handing a token to a courtesan who adjusts the collar of her gilded necklace. The necklace glints under the midday sun seeping through lattice windows. You inhale the faint scent of cardamom from his gauntlet, then step aside to let him pass. You note how foreign tokens of appreciation could include prized horses, exotic peacocks, or even small carved ivories that served as conversation pieces. You approach a cluster of Phoenician sailors, whose boat flags flutter like colourful sea creatures against an ochre sky. They hum sea shanties in a guttural harmony as they offer a courtesan freshly caught mackerel grilled on charcoal embers. A fringe account claims Phoenicians introduced the idea of attaching tiny amphora charms to necklaces worn by courtesans as good luck talismans. You stifle a laugh at the thought of floating charms jostling against spices inside wool pouches. A scholarly debate hums beneath every transaction. Historians still argue whether these foreign visits reshaped local customs or merely added flair to established practices. Some argue that Mediterranean guests introduced wine-drinking rituals that blended with traditional Egyptian beer ceremonies. Others insist that Egyptian hospitality remained distinct, with imported elements assimilated rather than adopted wholesale. You ponder the lines between cultural exchange and cultural appropriation long before either term existed. You move toward a low alcove draped in dyed linen where an interpreter recites terms for a Frankish trader who arrived via coastal trading posts. His accent slices through whispers like a scythe through reeds. He nods gravely when told that certain services include musical recitals on reed pipes, while others guarantee privacy behind woven screens. Joke 3 crosses your mind because modern service industries still struggle with clear pricing and package deals. The courtesans here maintain a ledger in multiple scripts, laid out on a polished stone slab. Greek letters bend around hieroglyphs and cursive demotic to capture names, dates, and fees in a polyglot tapestry of commerce. Parchment fragments from Jebel Barkal show similar bilingual entries, suggesting that cross-cultural companionship had formal recognition, even in Nubian territories. Fringe theorists claim that some entries were secretly coded to avoid Roman tax collectors. You grin because history is full of accountants hiding ledgers in plain sight. You listen to the soft strum of a lute next door where a Lydian trader and a courtesan exchange ephemeral glances as she plucks a single string. Their music blends Eastern scales with Egyptian melodies to create a hypnotic lullaby echoing through arches. You imagine this musical fusion as an intimate prelude to further engagements. That blending of artistic traditions speaks to deeper connections beyond commerce. As afternoon light shifts to gold, you watch as the quay empties of caravans and ships wave their sails for departure. Courtesans gather at stone benches to compare tokens received, laughing softly as they recount unusual gifts. They trade stories of mares, exotic birds, and perfumes distilled from faraway cedar forests. You follow their laughter like a guide, sensing camaraderie beyond transactional roles. You pause at the river's edge as barges pull away under a rosy sky. The calls of merchants merge with the gentle lapping of water at the hulls. You realize that foreign clients did more than enrich purses. They infused this hidden world with spices, languages, and artistic currents that rippled through Egyptian society. You pat the cool stone railing and ponder tomorrow's return to selling space inside frescoed walls and hush of secret courtyards. With the sun's last rays glazing the water, you inhale deeply, carrying with you the echo of distant tongues and laughter mixed with clinking tokens. You drift toward the nearest ferry back to central Memphis, letting the river's sway lull your senses. Each foreign exchange left its mark on both visitor and host alike. You settle into the wooden bench and prepare for what tomorrow's journey will reveal about myths, realities, and the complex tapestry woven by those who sought solace and secrecy on the Nile's banks. You return to a shaded portico, where a group of travelling Greek scholars sit cross-legged on reed mats, their scrolls unfurled and their voices rising with a theatrical cadence. The scent of roasted chickpeas and freshly baked barley bread drifts from a nearby market stall, and a faint hum of a double flute weaves through the background as they recount tales of sacred prostitutes said to serve in Egyptian temples. Their stories are vivid and confident, yet you sense a layer of embellishment clinging to every syllable. You probably think these accounts carry the weight of truth, but as you listen more closely, the edges of their tales begin to fray. A mainstream historical fact grounds the moment. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, claimed that Egyptian women were compelled to offer themselves in temples as acts of devotion, comparing the practice to rites he said existed in Babylon. Yet no Egyptian source corroborates his statement, leaving his account dangling like a lone papyrus boat on the current. Historians still argue whether he misinterpreted fertility rites, relied on second-hand gossip, or knowingly exaggerated to titillate his Greek audience. You follow the scholars' voices as they wander into a courtyard adorned with painted pillars where Greek inscriptions and Egyptian hieroglyphs intersect. One scroll, read aloud with a flourish, describes maidens of the moon, who waited at temple gates and blessed visitors with sacred intimacy. A younger scribe raises an eyebrow and points out that no Egyptian temple archive mentions such an order, sparking a quiet debate under the hot afternoon sun. Fringe whispers suggest that these so-called maidens may have simply been trained musicians and dancers, their art misread by foreigners eager to project familiar narratives. You smirk at the thought that cultural misunderstanding may be as old as trade itself. A gust of wind carries the sound of distant boat horns from the Nile, and you glance at a faded wall relief showing women with sistrums, the musical instruments linked to Hathor's worship. Some scholars argue these depictions show priestesses leading festival dances, while fringe theorists claim the same scenes hint at erotic ceremonies. Historians still argue whether these images reflect entertainment for deities or embellished rituals spun into scandal by outside observers. You can almost hear the debate simmering like lentil stew in a clay pot nearby. You pass beneath a colonnade where two translators quarrel over the term hetera, a word used in Greek texts to describe female companions. One insists that Greek writers projected their own social structures onto Egyptian society, equating entertainers with intimate partners. The other counters that cross-cultural exchanges could have produced hybrid roles blending art, music, and intimacy. Joke one flickers in your mind as you imagine these translators throwing papyrus scrolls like frisbees in frustration, while their audience nods off in the midday heat. In the far corner of the courtyard, a weathered merchant leans on a cedar staff and recounts hearing of star-blessed dancers during a pilgrimage to Dendera. He claims these women anointed pilgrims with lotus oil and whispered blessings under the moonlight, gestures he swears carried a charge of divinity. A younger historian nearby rolls her eyes, muttering that no temple ledger records fees or rosters for such a group. Fringe accounts suggest Greek travelers conflated blessing rituals with intimacy, their stories rippling across the Mediterranean as thrilling half-truths. The smell of burning myrrh wafts from a bronze censer as you step into a shaded library alcove where papyrus rolls lie stacked in tall wicker baskets. A demotic scribe carefully unrolls a text and points out that most surviving Egyptian documents about women in temples focus on administrative duties, not romantic services. She argues that if temple courtesans existed, their roles were either rare or deliberately hidden. Historians still argue whether this silence masks a social taboo or reveals that Herodotus simply embroidered his tale for Greek audiences craving scandal. You step back into the sunlit square as a trio of Greek poets rehearse a ballad about veil-lifted maidens of Thebes, who, according to their song, could secure divine favor for any pilgrim willing to pay their tribute. A passerby mutters that these bards embellish everything from river floods to crocodile sizes, and your lips twitch in a grin. Joke too bubbles up as you imagine Herodotus himself, nodding along with exaggerated tales, quill scratching eagerly as if he were the ancient world's top travel blogger. A breeze rustles papyrus stalks in a nearby canal, as you pause by a faded fresco of women weaving garlands beside a temple wall. The garlands gleam faintly with pigment traces of gold, and some believe these symbolize divine offerings rather than flirtation. Others whisper that the garlands marked a signal to chosen clients, though no corroborating record supports the idea. Historians still argue whether these floral motifs belong to ritual symbolism alone or double as coded invitations whispered through petals. As the shadows stretch long across the stones, you watch the Greek scholars roll up their scrolls and prepare to board their barges. Their voices still carry, repeating tales that will ripple outward across ports and marketplaces from Rhodes to Athens. The sun dips lower, casting the pillars in a red glow that turns every silhouette into a living hieroglyph. You linger on the quay, watching the boats pull away, and realizing how a single foreign account could seed centuries of myth. Without the balance of native sources, stories of sacred prostitutes became more potent than truth, carried on winds of curiosity and spectacle. Joke 3 surfaces as you imagine a scribe from Memphis shaking his head, sighing that one traveler's tale could make an entire civilization sound like a temple cabaret. With the evening coolness settling in, you follow the curve of the canal back toward the city's heart. The echoes of foreign tongues fade behind you, replaced by the rhythmic splash of oars and the murmur of frogs along the reeds. Tomorrow you will move beyond legend to trace the lives of women navigating the space between privilege and peril, their stories resting not in rumor but in the texture of surviving records. You wake to the soft sound of clay jars being stacked and step into a shaded courtyard where 2 courtesans sit on woven mats, sorting through silver rings and freshly dyed linen. The faint scent of cedar and warm barley bread drifts in from a nearby kitchen while sunlight filters through slatted wooden screens. Here, away from the bustling quay and foreign chatter, you glimpse the dual nature of their lives, where privilege walks hand in hand with the weight of stigma. You probably imagine that their existence was either all indulgence or unrelenting hardship, but the truth sways somewhere in between like a boat on the Nile's current. One mainstream historical fact gives this balance shape. Decrees from the reign of Ptolemy II record instances where courtesans were allowed to inherit property, run household workshops, and even employ servants, making them among the few women who could act as independent economic agents. Yet, alongside these rights, temple archives and village records reveal frequent complaints lodged by neighbors about disruptive houses and women whose voices carry into the streets, a polite way of documenting social disapproval. Historians still argue whether these complaints reflected moral outrage, jealousy over wealth, or genuine public disturbance. You follow a narrow hall lined with colorful frescoes showing boats, lotuses, and offering tables, the walls designed to impress visiting clients but also to mask the sound of gossip drifting from the next room. Inside, 2 apprentices practice singing verses to Hathor, their voices steady and measured, while a senior courtesan instructs them on how to blend formal prayer with lyrical storytelling. A fringe whisper suggests that some of these women, despite their profession, were chosen to perform sacred songs during festivals, a rare honor that lent them temporary respectability. You smile because festival performers today still wear costumes that win applause, even if whispers follow them home. You pass into a side chamber where a low wooden table holds a scroll detailing fines imposed on a courtesan who refused service to a minor official during a banquet. The penalty amounts to 2 deben of silver and a half sack of wheat. The record shows she paid the fine and resumed work within a week. You picture her shaking her head at the absurdity while still managing her accounts. Historians still argue whether such fines indicate oppression or demonstrate that these women wielded enough leverage to make refusals despite financial penalties. Further along, you step into a sunlit terrace where 3 courtesans recline on cushioned benches, sipping diluted wine mixed with honey. One wears a string of imported amber beads, a gift from a grateful client, while another adjusts her wig woven with strands of blue faience beads. They laugh softly as they recount the night's conversations, yet their eyes flick toward the alley whenever strangers pass, wary of judgment from locals. Joke 1 springs to mind as you imagine them rolling their eyes at neighbors who frown by day but queue quietly by night. Beneath a pergola of date palms, you find a clay tablet describing how courtesans sometimes pooled their earnings to buy small tracts of farmland on the city outskirts. These holdings provided grain for their households and surplus for market trade. A fringe detail surfaces about one group who allegedly donated part of their harvest to a local shrine to curry favor with community elders, blending philanthropy with subtle reputation management. You imagine their careful calculations as they measured barley into baskets, hoping goodwill could shield them from whispers. In a shaded alcove, 2 older women embroider linen panels while discussing a petition they plan to deliver to a local magistrate. The petition requests protection against harassment from an overzealous tax collector. Their voices carry a calm authority, revealing women accustomed to defending their place in a society that alternately relies on and condemns them. Historians still argue whether petitions like these were commonly granted or mostly ignored, leaving women to fend for themselves. You slip into another chamber where musicians pluck strings on a lute while a client listens, leaning back on a low bench with a smile. These performances offered moments of calm connection, reminding you that companionship extended beyond mere transaction. Some sources describe courtesans acting as intermediaries, passing messages between merchants or arranging introductions among officials. Joke 2 crosses your mind as you imagine them serving as the ancient equivalent of a professional networking service with better refreshments. At the rear of the house, a wooden lattice door leads to a narrow alley. Beyond it lies a wall covered in faint chalk marks left by neighborhood children. Some are playful drawings of cats and boats, but others are crude sketches and nicknames mocking the women inside. A fringe rumor suggests some courtesans paid local youths in bread or coins to erase such graffiti, a small act to keep their dignity intact. You smile because public opinion has always been fickle, painted as easily as it can be scrubbed away. The day wanes as you wander into a quiet atrium where the scent of lotus and jasmine lingers. A courtesan kneels beside a low altar dedicated to Tauret, the goddess of protection and childbirth. She lights a small oil lamp and murmurs a prayer before returning to her duties. This private ritual reveals how these women sought spiritual comfort, even as society judged them harshly. Historians still argue whether such devotions offered genuine solace or were pragmatic acts to maintain an image of piety. As the evening breeze cools the courtyard stones, you take in the layers of this life. These women held property, managed resources, and entertained influential men, yet still endured scrutiny and penalties that reminded them of their place. The privileges they earned came with a cost measured not just in silver, but in constant negotiation with public opinion. Joke 3 slips into your thoughts as you picture them sighing, knowing their neighbors' gossip flowed as steadily as the Nile itself. You step out into the street as dusk paints the mud-brick walls a deep red. The murmurs of evening vendors rise from the market square while the distant hum of a sistrum drifts through the warm air. You reflect on the delicate balance of power and stigma these courtesans navigated and realize their lives were far more layered than any simple caricature. With the last light fading, you follow the path toward the next quarter, where rumors of strange rites swirl and the air thickens with mystery, ready for tomorrow's revelations. You step into a dimly lit gallery tucked beneath a ruined temple annex, where the scent of beeswax and old stone hangs heavy in the still air. Flickering oil lamps illuminate walls painted with faded images of lotus blooms, serpents, and figures in flowing linen. The place feels different from the orderly brothel halls and polished courtyards you've seen, as though this chamber holds whispers of practices meant for only a few eyes and ears. You probably think every ritual in this world was public and ceremonial, but here the energy feels secretive, more private, and layered in rumor. One mainstream historical fact frames this space. The Turin erotic papyrus, dated to around 1150 BCE, contains explicit drawings paired with humorous captions, suggesting that erotic imagery and storytelling were not entirely taboo in Egyptian society. While scholars view it as satirical entertainment rather than documentary evidence, it reveals that erotic expression existed openly enough to be preserved on costly papyrus. Historians still argue whether depictions like these hint at ritual performances or if they were strictly intended as bawdy humor for private audiences. In a corner alcove, you find a carved wooden box holding miniature figurines of women and animals in suggestive postures. Fringe whispers suggest that some figurines were used during fertility rites, dedicated to gods like Min and Hathor, not as offerings but as tools for symbolic enactment. Others dismiss the idea as pure fantasy, claiming they were simply amulets for good luck or jokes exchanged among friends. You smile because either way, these carved objects have a liveliness that feels strangely human despite their stiff postures. Moving deeper, you pause before a mural showing masked dancers holding garlands of papyrus and lilies, their faces obscured by painted wooden masks. Some researchers believe these masked dancers participated in seasonal festivals tied to the rising of the Nile, offering performances meant to ensure prosperity and abundance. Fringe accounts claim that beneath the masks, participants may have offered more intimate blessings to patrons, blurring the lines between sacred dance and private companionship. Historians still argue whether these processions doubled as discreet matchmaking events or were wholly symbolic spectacles. You step over a line of smooth stones, set into the floor, and enter a low chamber where the air grows warmer, carrying a faint trace of burnt cinnamon. On a stone pedestal rests a half-broken bowl coated with a reddish residue. A fragmentary inscription nearby speaks of warming the body before the blessing of Min. Some scholars interpret this as preparation for ritual bathhouses or sauna, like rooms used in festival contexts. Fringe whispers take it further, claiming that couples were anointed with heated oils and instructed in fertility rites within these spaces. You can't help but think it sounds like a Bronze Age spa experience with more chanting than cucumber water. A lute's faint hum drifts in from the next corridor, where a musician rehearses a slow, undulating melody. His notes echo softly off stone, mingling with the rhythmic tapping of a small hand drum. Courtesans or performers, depending on interpretation, might have joined these gatherings as singers, storytellers, or hosts, offering sensory immersion that blurred art and intimacy. Joke one flickers in your thoughts as you imagine ancient event planners marketing these evenings as full-package cultural experiences, only without flyers to pass out at the market. Under another arch you spot a wall relief, depicting a pair of entwined serpents circling a lotus blossom, their bodies coiled in a way that draws the eye. Some interpret this as a symbol of rebirth and cosmic balance, while fringe voices argue that the motif carries erotic undertones tied to fertility invocations. Historians still argue whether serpentine imagery at such sites represents natural cycles alone or coded allusions to rituals no scribe dared document explicitly. The debate feels as endless as the serpents chasing their tails in stone. In a shadowed alcove sits a small jar sealed with hardened resin. When you unstopper it, the aroma of spiced wine mixed with ground blue lotus rises into the cool air. Blue lotus, revered for its intoxicating effects, appears often in banquet scenes painted on tomb walls. Scholars believe it induced mild euphoria during festivals, but fringe theories suggest it played a role in enhancing intimate or trance-like experiences. You smirk because ancient party favors sound surprisingly close to modern indulgences, minus the glowing wristbands. A soft glow draws you toward a shrine at the far end of the chamber. A painted figure of Hathor smiles serenely, her crown of cow horns and sun disk glowing in the lamplight. At her feet, offerings of pomegranates and alabaster jars suggest regular visits by those seeking blessings for love, fertility, or emotional solace. One rumor insists that courtesans left votive locks of hair here as tokens of devotion or gratitude. Joke too drifts across your mind as you picture ancient wig makers shaking their heads at all that donated hair. In the center of the room, you find a bronze brazier still faintly warm. Its ashes hold traces of myrrh and cinnamon bark, likely burned during rituals to mask other scents and mark the space as sacred. Historians still argue whether these ceremonies leaned more towards spiritual symbolism or practical entertainment for wealthy patrons seeking divine favor wrapped in earthly pleasure. The ambiguity lingers like smoke, impossible to capture fully before it dissipates. As the evening deepens, the chamber grows quieter, the only sound the occasional pop of a cooling oil lamp. You leave the gallery, stepping back into the cooler desert air beneath a sky scattered with bright stars. These whispers of exotic rites, however blurred by rumor, reveal another layer of complexity in how companionship, belief, and spectacle interwove. Joke 3 crosses your mind as you imagine an ancient town crier trying to summarize tonight's rituals without sparking either outrage or stampedes. With the scent of cinnamon and blue lotus still clinging to your cloak, you follow a narrow path toward the faint lights of the main road. Tomorrow, you will trace the portraits and epitaphs these women left behind, the literary echoes that shaped how they were remembered long after their voices faded into the desert wind. You step into a quiet scriptorium, where reed pens scratch softly against papyrus, the air thick with the smell of lamp oil and powdered ink. Shelves line the walls, filled with rolled scrolls and bound codices, while a scribe dips his brush into a small jar of soot and gum to copy a funerary epitaph. These texts, though often formal, hold flashes of personality that reveal how courtesans were remembered, praised, or mocked in writing long after their voices faded. You probably expect every word to be reverent and solemn, but some of these literary portraits sparkle with satire or raw emotion, giving you glimpses of lives that refuse to fit tidy labels. One mainstream historical fact grounds the scene. Ostraca fragments and funerary stelae from Thebes and Oxyrhynchus include inscriptions that identify women by affectionate nicknames, such as "She who brings joy to the harp" or "Lotus of the evening," suggesting their roles as entertainers and companions were publicly acknowledged in certain circles. Yet in comedic papyri, similar figures appear as punchlines, portrayed as clever tricksters or spendthrifts. Historians still argue whether these opposing portrayals reflect distinct social tiers of courtesans or simply the duality of public fascination and scorn. On a nearby desk, lies a satirical tale written in demotic script, describing a woman who tricks a wealthy merchant by swapping his jars of imported wine for coloured water, all while singing him praises to keep him distracted. Fringe whispers suggest the story was based on a real courtesan whose cleverness became local legend, though others see it as pure comedic exaggeration. You chuckle at the thought that humour at someone's expense is a pastime as old as writing itself. Joke one surfaces when you imagine an ancient storyteller pausing mid-recital just to wink at the audience while rattling a cup for tips. You turn to another scroll where a more sombre epitaph describes a woman named Ket, beloved of Hathor and gentle of voice, whose patrons erected a limestone stela adorned with painted garlands. The inscription praises her generosity, claiming she clothed orphans and donated oil to temple lamps. Historians still argue whether such epitaphs reflect genuine philanthropy or serve as crafted reputations funded by clients seeking to polish their own public image by honouring a favoured companion. In a shadowed alcove, a scribe unfurls a longer narrative poem about a figure called the Weaver of Nights. The verses paint her as both muse and menace, describing her beauty as a snare and her laughter as a balm for weary traders. The language shifts between admiration and warning, a duality that makes you picture audiences leaning closer by lamplight. A fringe theory claims that such poems doubled as subtle advertisements, circulated quietly to attract wealthy clients. Joke 2 creeps in as you picture ancient poets sneaking flyers into market stalls like guerrilla marketers of romance. A pile of ostraca in the corner holds shorter, less formal jottings, quick caricatures, bawdy rhymes, and notes likely passed among friends. One shard reads, "She dances like the Nile flows, but her purse empties quicker than a summer canal." You grin, sensing the humour even across millennia. Historians still argue whether these lines should be taken as playful banter or genuine social critique aimed at particular women. Beside the ostraca rests a narrow tablet engraved with a hymn-like passage to Hathor that names several women as her attendants of joy. Some scholars interpret this as a ceremonial role, while others view it as a euphemistic acknowledgement of their companionship during festivals. The ambiguity makes the tablet feel alive, inviting multiple readings. Fringe whispers suggest that such hymns were commissioned by courtesans themselves to intertwine their memory with divine favour. You smirk at the thought of ancient marketing campaigns, hymn by hymn. Across the room, a younger scribe reads aloud from a comedic dialogue where a courtesan debates a pompous priest about the virtues of wine, music, and laughter. The audience of artisans bursts into quiet laughter as she outwits the priest with sharp retorts. This scene suggests that some women not only entertained, but also shaped popular performance culture through wit and theatrical skill. Joke 3 lingers as you imagine the priest's flustered face, more crimson than his ceremonial sash. As the oil lamps burn low, you linger before a shelf stacked with papyri sealed in clay jars. Their labels indicate private letters, many too fragile to open, but you sense they carry fragments of affection and remembrance. Some may hold heartfelt messages from former patrons or apprentices, the sort of quiet tributes never meant for public reading. Historians still argue whether these letters, when found, will rewrite our understanding of the bonds courtesans formed beyond commerce. You step outside into the crisp evening air, the scent of ink and papyrus still clinging to your cloak. The scribes extinguish their lamps behind you, their murmured voices fading into the dark corridors. Tonight's discoveries reveal how the written word immortalized these women as muses, jesters, benefactors, and enigmas all at once. Their literary portraits, half praise, half parody, gave them a presence that outlived their footsteps on the Nile's banks. As you follow a torchlit path back toward the market quarter, you wonder what other traces wait in stone, pigment, and ink. Tomorrow you will trace their faces and gestures preserved not in words, but in the painted and carved iconography that still stares back across 3,000 years. You step into a dim hall within a crumbling limestone complex where walls are alive with colors that have survived 3 millennia. The air smells of dust and faint resin from ancient sealants as your eyes adjust to the glow of oil lamps. These murals and carvings speak a language beyond words, a visual record of gestures and symbols, some overtly celebratory and others more secretive. You probably expect to see straightforward depictions of banquets and music, but these scenes carry layered meanings that invite you to look twice before deciding what they reveal. One mainstream historical fact guides you through these images. On tomb walls at sites like Deir el-Medina and Thebes, artisans frequently painted banquets where women play lutes, pour wine, and offer floral garlands. Roles scholars largely identify as entertainers and companions. Yet many of these depictions include symbols like lotus blossoms and sistrums, which hold layered meanings linked to rebirth and divine joy, as well as mortal pleasure. Historians still argue whether these banquet scenes depict simple social gatherings or encode subtler messages about intimacy and spiritual renewal. You trace your hand along a relief of 2 women holding sistrums while facing a seated nobleman. Their flowing linen robes cling lightly to their forms, and their wigs are adorned with petals. One fringe interpretation suggests the posture of their arms, bent slightly outward, signals an invitation beyond mere music. Others argue the positioning reflects a standard dance gesture, a ritualized movement designed to please Hathor as much as human guests. You smile because in either case, these details feel carefully staged, like frames in a silent film with multiple possible scripts. Further along, you encounter a painted frieze where couples recline on mats beside tall jars of beer. Small hieroglyphs float near their figures, naming them not as spouses but as delights of the evening, a phrase that sparks debate among epigraphers. Some say it simply denotes festival hosts, while fringe voices claim it refers to paid companions celebrated during seasonal rites. Historians still argue whether these figures were immortalized as honored entertainers or as symbols of a broader cultural acceptance of intimacy during festivities. Under an arch painted with deep blue pigment, you notice a subtle detail on a nearby stela. A courtesan is shown offering a lotus blossom to a figure of Hathor, her eyes downcast while a nobleman looks on. Some believe the lotus represents a spiritual offering of renewal, while others interpret it as a coded gesture promising sensual connection. Joke 1 flits through your mind as you picture a confused scribe carving this scene and muttering, "Lotus or flirt," you decide, knowing future viewers would puzzle over it for centuries. Near a collapsed wall, fragments of a once grand mural lie scattered, revealing only partial images. One surviving section shows a woman leaning toward a seated man while holding a goblet, her posture intimate without being explicit. Fringe whispers suggest these fragments belong to a series of murals designed for private feasting halls where art doubled as subtle advertising for the household's companions. Others insist these pieces simply captured moments of hospitality for posterity. The ambiguity lingers, much like the faint smell of resin clinging to the stone. In another chamber, a sculpted lintel depicts dancers mid-step, their hips swayed and arms curved in fluid arcs. Small anklets carved into the stone suggest movement, while a single musician crouches with a double flute nearby. Some fringe interpretations claim these images show companions performing specialized dances as preludes to private encounters. More conservative voices argue that such depictions highlight artistic skill rather than hidden meanings. Historians still argue whether motion implied by these carvings was symbolic of harmony or suggestive of intimacy. You pause by a small niche where a fragmentary statue of Bes, the dwarf god of household protection, grins beneath a garland of faded beads. Some courtesans likely prayed to Bes for safety and prosperity, while fringe theories propose they also left tokens in his shrines as markers of secret agreements. You can almost hear Bes chuckling, his wide grin suggesting he knows far more than his sculpted lips will ever say. Joke too comes to mind when you imagine him as the ancient world's most discreet doorman, watching everything but speaking to no one. Across the hall, a surviving section of wall shows two women adjusting their wigs beside a mirrored pool, their reflections painted faintly beneath them. One leans forward with a reed pen tucked behind her ear, as though writing down a note. Scholars suggest this scene portrays moments of personal grooming, but others propose it subtly highlights their literacy and business acumen, a quiet assertion that these women were not mere performers. The thought lingers that these murals held layered purposes to flatter, to market, and to preserve a memory of lives that balanced artistry with enterprise. A final chamber reveals an unexpected detail, a relief of a seated nobleman offering a gold ring to a woman labelled Mistress of Song. Her eyes are painted with heavy kohl, her hand raised in acknowledgement. Some believe the ring symbolizes a formal patronage contract, while fringe theories argue it marks an early depiction of companionship agreements tied to wealth and exclusivity. Historians still argue whether these tokens of patronage blurred the line between private relationships and formal contracts, or stood apart as purely symbolic gestures. As you leave the limestone complex, the cool desert night washes over you, carrying a faint trace of the resin and pigment that clung to the air inside. These murals, reliefs, and statues do not offer plain answers, but together they form a visual chorus that hums with the complexity of Egyptian, social, and spiritual life. Joke 3 drifts through your thoughts as you picture a time traveler asking a painter what the lotus meant, only to be told, "It depends on how much you paid for the tour." You follow the torchlit path down toward the quiet streets, the memory of painted dancers and silent lotus blossoms flickering in your mind. Tomorrow you will step away from art and symbolism to explore the physical toll of this life, where beauty and luxury could not shield these women from the hazards they faced in body and health. You make your way down a sloped stone ramp into a cool underground chamber where the faint smell of myrrh mixes with the sharp tang of copper tools. The air feels heavy, as if the walls themselves carry the weight of whispered warnings about the price paid by those who lived behind perfumed curtains and painted walls. You probably expect their lives to be all banquets, silk, and honeyed wine. But here the traces left behind speak of bodies that bore the marks of relentless work, disease, and risks no garland of lotus flowers could erase. One mainstream historical fact frames this sobering descent. Medical papyri, such as the Ebers Papyrus, dating to around 1550 BCE, describe treatments for gynecological conditions, sexually transmitted infections, and complications from childbirth, some involving mixtures of honey, garlic, or acacia gum. These texts hint at the prevalence of ailments faced by women who lived with frequent intimacy as part of their livelihood. Historians still argue whether these remedies were practical solutions based on empirical observation, or primarily ritualistic recipes invoking divine intervention. You stop beside a low stone bench where a faded inscription lists the ingredients of an ointment: honey for cleansing, natron for drying, and ochre as a protective barrier. A physician's assistant might have prepared such mixtures for women experiencing irritation or infection, though the efficacy of some recipes remains doubtful. A fringe whisper claims that courtesans sometimes relied on imported resins, like frankincense, mixed with ground pearls to mask symptoms, rather than treat underlying issues. You wince imagining the sting while joke one stirs as you think about how little has changed in people preferring cosmetics over cures when appearances are on the line. Further inside, you see a fragment of a clay tablet describing instructions for birthing stools used in households where courtesans sometimes gave birth between periods of active work. The text notes the use of charms invoking Tararet, the protective hippopotamus goddess, alongside practical measures like midwives and herbal infusions. Historians still argue whether these births resulted in children raised within these households or sent to extended family or temples to be fostered. The lack of certainty lingers like the faint echo of dripping water in the chamber. Beside a shallow niche, several tiny faience amulets shaped like dwarfs and frogs rest in a small basket, likely once worn as protection against complications or infertility. Some scholars believe women kept entire sets of protective charms around their necks or ankles, while fringe voices suggest they were also given to clients as talismans, merging commerce and spirituality. You imagine the awkward exchange, picturing a patron walking away with a frog amulet as if it were a loyalty card. Joke 2 sneaks in when you think about someone proudly flashing that amulet in a market stall as proof of divine luck. You step into another room, lit by a single lamp set in a carved wall niche. On a reed mat lies a bundle of reed pens, a half-full ink pot, and several papyrus sheets covered in notes about fees owed to a physician. One entry specifies payment in grain and 2 small jars of oil, a reminder that medical care came at a cost even for women who earned well compared to others. Historians still argue whether brothel managers regularly arranged care as part of their oversight, or if women had to negotiate privately for treatment, risking debt when illness struck. Near the far wall, you notice a painted depiction of the dwarf god Bes stomping his feet beside a musician, both framed by vines and flowers. While Bes was a household protector, his image also appears in contexts linked to childbirth and sexual health. Fringe whispers claim courtesans prayed to Bes, not only for physical protection, but to grant resilience during exhausting festival seasons when back-to-back engagements taxed their strength. The god's grin seems to mock the unspoken burdens hidden beneath coal-lined eyes. A clay jar in the corner contains a desiccated remnant of blue lotus petals, likely used to brew a mild sedative for easing pain. The plant, with its soporific effects, was part of many medicinal concoctions, sometimes steeped in wine. Some scholars believe it was used both to dull discomfort and to induce light euphoria before or after clients departed. Joke 3 crosses your mind as you picture a weary courtesan muttering, 2 cups of lotus wine and I can almost ignore the tax collector. As you return toward the ramp, your fingers trail over a wall painted with faint outlines of women seated before what might be healers or scribes. The pigments are faded, but the postures, one with a hand pressed to her abdomen, another leaning forward as if speaking softly, suggest moments of care rather than ceremony. Historians still argue whether these are scenes of genuine medical aid or symbolic depictions of purification rituals before major festivals. The uncertainty feels like a constant undertone in this silent corridor. When you step back into the evening air, the heavy scent of myrrh still clings to your cloak. The stars are emerging over the horizon, casting soft silver reflections on the Nile in the distance. These chambers remind you that even in lives cushioned by silver, fine linen, and luxury oils, the physical toll was real and inescapable. It was a reality endured quietly, away from the laughter of lutes and the perfumed glow of banquet lamps. You follow the gravel path back toward the hum of the city, feeling the cool wind on your face, as if it carries the quiet sighs of women who lived these truths. Tomorrow, you will leave the sick rooms behind and step into the realm of laws and loopholes, where ink on papyrus could sometimes grant these women protections few others enjoyed. You walk along a quiet colonnade in the administrative quarter of Memphis, the air heavy with the smell of ink, oiled wood, and papyrus rolls stacked like bricks on tall shelves. The muted scrape of styluses on wax tablets echoes through the hall as scribes record the daily accounts of merchants, priests, and courtesans alike. Here, far from banquet halls and incense-filled chambers, power rests in the neat lines of ink on reed-thin sheets. You probably imagine laws as rigid tools used against these women, but the papyri reveal something different. Sometimes the ink worked in their favor, carving out spaces of leverage where few expected it. A mainstream historical fact sits at the center of this world. Surviving documents from the Ptolemaic period, such as the papyrus revenue laws, outline specific taxes and registration systems for brothels, but also include provisions that allowed registered women to bring cases to court to recover unpaid fees or defend property rights. These women, though judged morally by neighbors, held a legal voice that many wives or servants lacked. Historians still argue whether this protection arose out of pragmatic economic interests or represented a deliberate attempt to regulate and normalize their work. You stop before a clerk reading from a contract in Demotic. The scroll details an agreement in which a courtesan lends 3 deben of silver to a local tavern keeper in exchange for partial ownership of his business. Her signature, marked with a small lotus symbol beside her name, secures her claim. A fringe whisper suggests the lotus mark was not just decorative, but a subtle sign of her profession, a mark that both confirmed identity and discouraged forgery. You picture the sly smile she must have worn, knowing the very symbol used to mock her in gossip, doubled as legal armor. Joke one drifts into your mind as you imagine her muttering, "Call me scandalous, but at least my contracts never bounce." Further down the hall, you study a slate covered in chalk hieratic writing that lists recent rulings from a local council. One decision finds a client 2 deben for failing to fulfill his end of a service contract, returning the amount plus a portion of his pledged grain to the courtesan. Historians still argue whether such fines were regularly enforced, or if they only applied when the women had patrons with influence backing their claims. The debate hums like a soft echo between the rows of papyrus bundles. Beyond the clerk's bench, a wooden chest sits open, filled with small clay seals stamped with hieroglyphic notations. Some seals represent taxes paid, while others bear the image of Tararet, marking exemptions from certain civic duties. A fringe theory holds that courtesans who paid higher registration fees could avoid forced temple service or labor drafts, a privilege not even some artisans enjoyed. You smile at the thought that paying extra could turn gossip into grudging respect, at least from overworked neighbors. Joke, too, nudges its way in as you picture one of these women waving her stamped seal and telling a complaining baker, "Enjoy the draft duty, I have garlands to weave instead." In a side alcove, 2 scribes argue over the wording of a decree involving inheritance rights. A courtesan named Isidora is documented as inheriting a small house, several jars of oil, and a share of a vineyard from a deceased patron. One scribe argues the property was hers by legal grant, while the other mutters that it was a calculated bequest meant to appease temple overseers. Historians still argue whether such inheritances reflect genuine affection and respect, or transactional arrangements meant to avoid disputes among male heirs. A stone shelf nearby holds a papyrus with faded writing that refers to a protective clause, allowing a courtesan to dismiss any client who arrives intoxicated beyond a certain point, with no refund required. This clause, while rare, appears in at least 2 known contracts from Oxyrhynchus, and scholars note it as a curious early form of workplace safeguard. Fringe whispers say some women use this rule to rid themselves of troublemakers while keeping their fees by declaring them unfit for service. Joke 3 curls at the edges of your thoughts as you imagine one of them whispering, "Drink all you want, but I'll still get my silver." In another chamber, you find a wooden bench where a magistrate's aide lays out a new registry for festival workers. The parchment includes a section for entertainers that some scholars believe discreetly encompassed courtesans. Registration provided them with access to legal recourse but also tied them to tax obligations. Historians still argue whether these registries functioned as protection, surveillance, or both, leaving you to wonder if the women viewed them as tools of empowerment or chains of bureaucracy. By a narrow window, you notice an abandoned ostracon etched with a short note, likely from one courtesan to another. It reads, "Keep the seal near your bed, for the collector comes at dawn." It is a mundane reminder of tax checks, but also a sign of camaraderie, one woman warning another to keep her proof of payment ready. That camaraderie feels just as valuable as any clause etched in papyrus. You step back outside into the fading light, the smell of warm ink and worn reed mats lingering in your nostrils. These legal traces remind you that the lives of courtesans were not entirely dictated by whispers and scandal. With carefully negotiated contracts, seals, and a willingness to wield the law, they carved out a space to protect their earnings, their property, and sometimes even their dignity. The river wind brushes your face as the sun lowers behind the pylons, and you know tomorrow's steps will lead into halls where law gives way to politics, where personal charm could sway power far beyond written contracts. You move through a long colonnade lined with statues of falcons and lions, the dusk light casting elongated shadows across polished limestone floors. The air smells faintly of spiced wine from a nearby banquet hall, and the smoke of cedarwood incense rising from bronze braziers. Here, whispers tell of courtesans who stepped beyond dimly lit rooms and perfumed courtyards, into spaces where politics and influence swirled like eddies in the Nile. You probably imagine these women as bystanders in the games of men, but the papyri and quiet gossip hint that some wielded charm and wit to nudge the course of power itself. One mainstream historical fact places you in this world of quiet maneuvering. Letters preserved in the Zenon papyri, dating to the 3rd century BCE, reference women acting as cultural intermediaries and entertainers for high officials, hosting gatherings where political discussions flowed as easily as wine. Some of these letters suggest these women served as trusted conduits of messages and confidences, blending social grace with subtle negotiation skills. Historians still argue whether they were mere accessories to male ambition, or active players securing influence for themselves and their allies. In a side chamber, you see a fresco of a woman draped in indigo linen, leaning close to a seated governor as she pours wine into a gold-handled cup. The governor's hand rests lightly on a scroll marked with a royal seal. A fringe whisper claims that this scene represents more than feasting. suggesting she acted as a courier for sensitive messages hidden in folded papyrus, tucked into the hollow stem of ceremonial cups. Others dismiss it as speculation, noting no direct evidence of such intrigue, though the visual hint lingers in the painted folds. Joke once surfaces as you imagine her saying, "Don't worry about the letter, just drink your wine before it cools," while smuggling state secrets beneath the rim. Farther along you overhear two servants whispering in a shaded antechamber. They mention a famed courtesan named Thais, who allegedly persuaded a provincial commander to divert grain shipments to her patrons during a festival famine. Though unverified, her name appears in a fragmentary account from a scribe noting unusual grain allocations. Historians still argue whether this influence was exaggerated by gossip or reflects actual leverage women held through personal alliances. The murmured tale feels as much like political theatre as it does historical record. You descend a short staircase into a vaulted room where musicians tune lyres while waiting for a gathering of bureaucrats and foreign envoys. Along one wall, a scribe adjusts a reed pen as he copies guest lists into both Greek and Demotic. Courtesans appear on the roster not by personal names but by epithets such as Mistress of Harmony or Voice of the Lotus, titles that sound ceremonial yet likely cloaked their true role as facilitators of private diplomacy. Fringe whispers suggest some envoys trusted these women more than official interpreters when negotiating informal accords. You grin, thinking of Joke 2 as you picture a courtesan whispering, "I translate both languages, but I only charge for one," while smoothing tensions with a smile. In the far corner, a low marble table holds a clay seal impression bearing the profile of a royal crown and a faint inscription referencing preferred guests. The seal suggests these companions gained entry to exclusive palace events where foreign traders and generals gathered under gilded rafters. Some scholars believe these women were vetted by palace staff to ensure loyalty, while others argue they functioned as social bridges, softening stiff interactions among diverse elites. Historians still argue whether this vetting elevated them into semi-official court figures, or simply bound them with obligations they could not refuse. You pass through a bronze doorway into a hall, where an Alexandrian merchant unrolls a papyrus covered with calculations for wine, grain, and linen, delivered to the estate of a Roman prefect. At the bottom, a line notes a separate delivery labelled "Gifts for the Singers," a euphemism scholars interpret as offerings for courtesans attached to the gathering. A fringe rumour claims that one particularly shrewd companion, known only by the title Daughter of the Reed, secured her own vineyard through a similar arrangement by convincing a wealthy prefect to grant her rights in lieu of coin. Whether true or embellished, the story lingers like the sweet tang of pomegranate wine in the air. At a smaller adjoining banquet, a Lydian envoy raises a goblet as he exchanges whispered toasts with a courtesan seated beside him. She adjusts the edge of his cloak, while he nods toward a scribe making notes at the far end of the table. These subtle gestures suggest layers of negotiation unfolding beneath polite conversation. Some scholars suggest such scenes reveal how these women mediated tensions between cultures through informal channels, their charm as valuable as any treaty. Joke 3 enters your thoughts as you imagine her whispering, "Careful, my fee doesn't include starting a war," while pouring another drink to ease his temper. As the evening progresses, you watch a senior courtesan step into a gilded carriage flanked by torchbearers, bound for the villa of a provincial governor. Her linen cloak gleams with tiny gold threads, catching the firelight with every step. Neighbors watch from the shadows, some in awe, others muttering behind their hands. Historians still argue whether such scenes represent true ascendancy or a precarious balancing act where favor could vanish as quickly as it was granted. You leave the colonnade and follow the soft glow of torches along a palm-lined path back toward the riverfront. The faint music from the banquet hall drifts after you, blending with the croak of distant frogs. Tonight's walk reminds you that influence often flows in whispers rather than proclamations, and that some courtesans carved space in the world of politics without needing a throne or crown. Their reach, though subtle, left ripples in the currents of power, ripples still visible in the fragments of papyri and stories scattered across the centuries, with the stars stretching over the Nile's silver surface. You take a slow breath and prepare for tomorrow, when the journey will lead into festival grounds and sacred rites, where sensuality and spirituality brushed shoulders in ways few dared record openly. You rise before dawn and walk along a dirt path, lined with reed fences toward the outskirts of a bustling city. The air smells of dew, smoke from early cooking fires, and faint traces of lotus carried on the morning breeze. Ahead, a cluster of temporary stalls and painted pavilions comes into view, set up for the festival honoring Hathor and Min, deities tied to fertility, music, and rebirth. The colors of the canopies glow as the rising sun brushes them in gold, and the hum of flutes and hand drums drifts over the chatter of vendors. You probably picture such celebrations as wild revelry, but beneath the dancing and songs lie layers of ritual where spiritual devotion and private service sometimes touched edges in ways that blurred neat distinctions. One mainstream historical fact anchors this early hour. Records from the Papyrus Harris I describe grand processions for Hathor, where priestesses and musicians carried sistrums, sang hymns, and distributed garlands to festival goers. These accounts confirm that women played central roles as performers and spiritual guides, but they avoid specifying any intimate exchanges. Historians still argue whether these omissions signal that sensual acts never occurred, or that such activities were intentionally unrecorded to preserve the sanctity of the rites. You step into a wide clearing where dancers in linen skirts spin in slow circles, their hair adorned with fresh flowers and their wrists jingling with bronze bangles. A fringe whisper claims that select dancers, after leading public hymns, retreated with patrons to secluded garden tents for private blessings tied to fertility prayers. Others argue this belief stems from Greek and Roman exaggerations, eager to paint Egypt as more exotic than reality allowed. The dancers' graceful steps continue, their shadows stretching across the sand like flowing water under the morning light. Joke one flits into your mind as you picture an ancient gossip muttering, "Sing a hymn, grant a blessing, refill the wine," while craning for the best view. Nearby, you watch two priests pour wine and honey into shallow bowls before a statue of Min, the god often depicted with unmistakably bold symbols of fertility. Attendees lay offerings of pomegranates, figs, and blue lotus petals at the god's feet. A papyrus from the Ptolemaic period describes rituals where devotees consumed diluted blue lotus wine to achieve mild euphoria during prayers. Historians still argue whether this practice was strictly devotional or created an atmosphere where participants felt freer to seek personal connections beyond worship. The air, thick with incense and sweet fruit, feels dreamlike as the ceremony unfolds. Along a line of wooden stalls, merchants sell perfumed oils, bead necklaces, and painted amulets featuring Hathor's face. A fringe account suggests that some courtesans purchased these trinkets not just for adornment but to signal availability to select festival patrons, using colors or charms as subtle codes. Skeptics say these purchases were simply festive flair, with no hidden meanings. You smirk at the thought of a woman tying a green bead to her sash, and a merchant whispering, "She's marked for blessings only," while pocketing the extra coin. Joke too stirs when you imagine festival goers trying to decode these colours like they were solving a puzzle at a street fair. You follow a winding path to a shaded garden, where acacia trees form a natural arch over smooth flagstones. Soft music drifts from hidden corners as pairs of attendees recline on mats, sipping lotus-infused drinks. Though the atmosphere feels serene, the garden's layout, with secluded alcoves screened by woven mats, suggests these spaces served multiple purposes. Some scholars believe such areas were purely for meditation and quiet conversation, while fringe theories propose they doubled as discreet meeting spots for negotiated companionship wrapped in spiritual blessings. Historians still argue which interpretation holds more truth, noting that neither festivals nor temples left explicit records of these interactions. Further along, a scribe kneels beside a table stacked with reed pens, documenting offerings brought by attendees. One entry lists 2 garlands, 1 amphora of wine, and a gift for the singer. The phrasing sparks debate among epigraphers, as gift for the singer appears in several festival accounts but remains unexplained. Some see it as simple payment for performers, while others suspect it references services not listed openly. You imagine the scribe smirking as he writes, well aware that future readers would debate his word choice for centuries. At the festival's edge, a troupe of musicians leads a twilight parade, their sistrums and drums guiding a line of worshippers carrying lanterns. Courtesans walk among them, offering garlands and singing blessings to the crowd. Their presence feels celebratory rather than transactional, yet fringe whispers hold that some used these moments to meet influential patrons who sought ongoing companionship beyond the festival. Joke 3 curls into your thoughts as you picture a courtesan leaning to a merchant mid-hymn and whispering, "Hathor bless you, see me after the lanterns dim." As the last notes of music fade into the night, you step away from the glowing lanterns and toward the riverbank, where barges rock gently against the current. The air feels cooler now, the smell of incense replaced by the earthy tang of wet reeds. These festivals, vibrant and layered, show a world where spiritual devotion and human desires coexisted in ways neither wholly sacred nor fully profane. The blurred boundaries leave you pondering how these women navigated such spaces without leaving a clear record. Their roles felt more than written. The moonlight spills across the Nile as you walk back toward the city's dim torches. Tomorrow you will leave the music and garlands behind to descend into the grit of excavations, where fragments of lamps, graffiti, and forgotten trinkets shed light on lives long hidden beneath the sand. You begin your descent into an active excavation site at the edge of the desert, where the scent of sunny-baked earth mixes with the faint tang of dust stirred by each passing breeze. The low hum of voices rises from trenches, where workers brush sand away from crumbled walls and sift soil through reed screens. Beyond the orderly camps and ceramic shards, archaeologists uncover pieces of lives once hidden from the official texts, fragments that whisper stories never meant for temple archives or scribes' tidy columns. You probably expect to find nothing more than broken bowls and bits of brick, but the ground yields tokens, graffiti, and personal items that speak far louder than any scroll. A mainstream historical fact ties you to this site. At Deir el-Medina, the workers' village near Thebes, excavations have revealed hundreds of ostraca-bearing jokes, names, and casual sketches, including women with exaggerated features paired with quips about their laughter or their skill in music. These fragments confirm that humour and reputation intertwined in the daily chatter of craftsmen and neighbours. Historians still argue whether these sketches point to courtesans working openly in the community or represent caricatures of entertainers from nearby urban quarters. You crouch beside a pit where a small terracotta oil lamp emerges, its handle shaped into a lotus bud. A fringe whisper suggests lamps like these were specially crafted for private gatherings, their delicate petals designed to glow warmly in dim rooms. Others argue they were simply decorative pieces, as common in households as in guest halls. You turn it over in your hands, feeling the faint grooves of the artisan's tools, and imagine its soft light flickering against linen drapes while distant music played. Joke 1 lingers as you think about how a lamp could be the ancient version of mood lighting without any dimmer switch to adjust. Further along, an archaeologist uncovers a string of faience beads tied to a tiny copper bell, the kind that might have been fastened to a belt or anklet. Some scholars believe such bells acted as playful signals during dances, while fringe voices suggest they doubled as subtle identifiers, letting certain patrons recognize specific companions by the sound alone. The jingling feels almost cheerful in the otherwise quiet dig, and you picture a room where every soft chime hinted at an unspoken introduction. In another trench, a broken pot shard bears a scrawled message in Demotic, roughly translated as, "She sings sweeter than the harp, but costs 2 jars of wine." It is neither formal contract nor serious record, just a casual comment scratched by someone passing time. Historians still argue whether graffiti like this reflects camaraderie, mild complaint, or backhanded praise, but its unguarded tone feels more genuine than any polished epitaph. Nearby, a fragment of wood painted with faint traces of blue and gold rests beside a shallow basin. The paint outlines a pair of hands cupped together, possibly part of a larger signboard. A fringe interpretation claims boards like this advertised private salons or bathhouses, where courtesans worked alongside masseuses and musicians. Others insist these painted boards were purely ornamental or devotional, meant to decorate doorways. You smirk at the thought of ancient advertising surviving as little more than a pair of painted palms, as if a mysterious logo waited for its branding campaign. Joke 2 follows as you imagine an ancient craftsman saying, "No words, just hands. Everyone will know what it means," while nodding proudly. In the shade of a half-collapsed wall, a pottery jar yields an unexpected treasure. Small clay tokens stamped with hieroglyphs for oil, bread, and entertainment. These tokens, exchanged like vouchers, could be redeemed for meals, drinks, or services, reducing the need to handle silver directly. Historians still argue whether brothel owners issued these tokens or if local taverns used them as part of package deals that quietly included companionship. Their very existence hints at a system more structured than gossip ever suggests. As you walk toward the deeper trench, the sharp smell of bitumen drifts from a newly unearthed layer. An excavator carefully lifts a carved ivory comb etched with tiny lotus flowers and BE's figures. Some believe such combs were everyday grooming items, while fringe whispers suggest they were ceremonial gifts from patrons to companions, combining practicality with protective symbolism. You roll the comb between your fingers and feel the grooves catch on your skin, like echoes of countless careful strokes through perfumed wigs. Near the site's edge, a lead archaeologist gestures toward a wall fragment covered with faint red chalk drawings. A few depict animals, others show stick figures reclining beside jars and stringed instruments. None are overtly explicit, yet the casual nature of the sketches gives them a familiarity absent from temple art. Historians still argue whether these figures were drawn by idle workers, patrons, or the women themselves, as light-hearted diversions between appointments. Joke 3 emerges as you imagine someone thousands of years ago carving a stick-figure party scene, unaware that future scholars would study it under magnifying glasses. As dusk cools the sight, you watch workers carefully wrap the oil lamp, beads, and tokens in linen before placing them into baskets for the journey to the conservation tent. The murmurs of the team blend with the wind sweeping across the dunes. These fragments, mundane yet intimate, reveal how much of life played out beyond the neat lines of official records. They are reminders that the courtesan's world was not just whispered in festivals or recorded in contracts, but etched, strung, and stamped into the very objects they touched. The sun dips low, painting the horizon in copper and violet, as you follow the faint glow of torches back toward the river. The smell of the dig site dust, bitumen, and faint traces of resin clings to your cloak. Tomorrow you will leave the pits and sherds behind to climb into the spaces where mythmakers lived, the storytellers and travelling bards who turned women's lives into tales that spread far beyond the banks of the Nile. You follow the curve of a worn cobblestone street as twilight settles over a caravanserai on the edge of an Egyptian trade hub. The air tastes of smoke from data palm fires and the faint salt carried upriver from the Mediterranean. At the far end of the courtyard, a circle of travellers huddles near a brazier, their shadows flickering on cracked plaster walls. These are storytellers and wandering bards, men who make their living turning scraps of truth into epics that ripple across markets and ports. You probably think the stories they spun about courtesans were simple exaggerations for entertainment, but in these dim corners you hear how a single tale could shift a woman's reputation across kingdoms, blurring fact and invention, until even her neighbours no longer knew where truth ended. A mainstream historical fact roots you in this haze of rumour. Greek and later Roman writers often amplified second-hand Egyptian anecdotes into sweeping accounts, framing women in temple or festival roles as seductresses, mystics, or harbingers of divine favour. Fragments of such tales appear not only in classical histories but in demotic papyri that parody these foreign retellings, painting bards as embellishers more than chroniclers. Historians still argue whether these tales spread primarily as intentional propaganda to exoticize Egypt, or as mere campfire entertainment that spiraled into persistent legend. You settle onto a reed mat near the circle as a grey-haired bard strums a two-westring lyre. He croons a tale about a moon-veiled one, a woman said to walk the rooftops of Thebes at night, anointing travellers with blue lotus oil and whispering fortunes in their ears. A younger listener murmurs that he heard she could charm a pharaoh himself, while another insists she was a simple musician turned phantom by drunken sailors. Fringe whispers hold that some bards crafted composite figures, merging multiple courtesans into a single legendary persona to make their stories irresistible. Joke 1 flickers in your thoughts as you imagine an exasperated courtesan muttering, "I play the harp twice, and suddenly I haunt rooftops for eternity." Nearby, a merchant scribe flips through a worn papyrus scroll inked with quick sketches and rhymed verses. The lines poke fun at wealthy patrons, comparing one governor's awkward dancing to a hippo wallowing in mud, while a garland bearer of Memphis coaxes him to keep time. These verses, while playful, immortalize courtesans as wily companions who maneuver clumsy elites into moments of levity. Historians still argue whether such songs gave women notoriety they welcomed, or burdens they could not shake, especially when such humour travelled faster than facts along caravan routes. A younger bard stands and recites a half-serious, half-satirical ballad about a courtesan called Keeper of the Silent Hall, said to have arranged secret feasts for merchants during curfews. A fringe theory suggests the ballad refers to real events during a grain shortage, when discreet gatherings helped maintain trade alliances. Others dismiss it as pure performance, crafted to thrill traders weary from long journeys. You grin when Joke 2 bubbles up, imagining the bard winking mid-verse and whispering, "For an extra amphora of wine, I'll tell you which hall still stands." The scent of roasting chickpeas wafts across the courtyard, as a pair of Nubian drummers pound a slow rhythm to underscore a tale about a jewel of Elephantine, a courtesan rumoured to have convinced a caravan master to ferry rare incense past tax checkpoints by distracting officials with music and feasts. Some scholars note this story appears, with variations, in multiple languages, suggesting it held enough spark to cross borders. Historians still argue whether it reflects a kernel of truth about the leverage some women wielded, or if it simply offered foreign audiences a taste of Egyptian flair. In the corner, a poet sketches a rough map in the sand with a stick, marking the Nile's curves and the cities where certain women are supposedly revered or feared. His companions nod as he names each figure with titles more than names: the Dancer of Bubastis, the Singer with Two Strings, the Vale of Tanis. A fringe claim suggests such maps occasionally doubled as guides for foreign patrons seeking these famed companions. Skeptics argue the maps were just props for theatrical recitals, more stagecraft than serious directions. Joke 3 slips in as you imagine a confused sailor squinting at a sand map and asking, "So, do I turn at the crocodile or the palm tree?" As the fire crackles low, the storytellers trade closing lines, some reciting blessings for Hathor while others laugh at their own embellishments. The bards gather their instruments and scrolls, tucking away tales destined to echo in taverns, markets, and noble courts alike. These stories, equal parts myth and memory, ensured that courtesans lived on as more than women in linen skirts and beaded wigs. They became characters larger than life, sometimes revered, sometimes mocked, but rarely forgotten. You rise as the circle dissolves and step into the cool night air. The crescent moon hangs low over the horizon, glinting on the Nile's dark waters. The murmured verses and strummed notes linger in your ears, a reminder of how reputation was as much a performance as any dance or song. Tomorrow, you will leave the voices of bards behind, to walk among the patron's world, tracing how governors, priests, and foreign traders left their own marks on the lives of these women, in ways both elevating and exploitative. You rise before the sun crests the horizon and follow the stone-paved road that curves toward the villas and estates of Memphis, where the air feels heavier with wealth and the faint perfume of imported cedar lingers near the gates. Guards in simple linen kilts lean on their spears, watching you with indifferent eyes as you pass through shaded archways into spaces where courtiers' fates often rose or fell with the whims of men who wielded titles, coin, and connections. You might expect these grand homes to keep their distance from women of such trade, but their walls hold contracts, gifts, and whispers that reveal how entangled these lives became when status and need crossed paths. A mainstream historical fact grounds your steps. Papyrus receipts and private letters from the Ptolemaic period record wealthy landowners paying stipends, not just for companionship, but to secure the presence of favoured courtesans at seasonal feasts and diplomatic dinners. These women sometimes received more than payment, including grain allotments or small tracts of land, effectively tying their livelihoods to estates. Historians still argue whether these arrangements functioned as semi-formal patronage or blurred into relationships indistinguishable from concubinage, leaving their true status in a murky space between independence and obligation. You pause by a sunlit courtyard, where a pair of servants polish alabaster bowls for an upcoming banquet. On a low table sits a rolled contract sealed with wax and bound by linen twine. A clerk unrolls it just enough to check a line referencing 2 deben of silver and 3 jars of honeyed wine, promised monthly to a woman named Hekanefa, in exchange for exclusive attendance at a merchant council's gatherings. A fringe whisper suggests that her exclusivity allowed her to quietly broker trade introductions, effectively acting as a behind-the-scenes negotiator. You smile at the thought of her shrugging as she pours wine, knowing she is closing deals while the men toast. Joke one lingers in your mind as you imagine her muttering, "I'm the only one here, working 2 jobs and one pays better." Farther along, you step into a cool chamber, where jars of oil and bolts of fine linen are stacked beside a writing desk. A scribe carefully logs deliveries from Nubian traders, noting which goods are earmarked as gifts for the beloved singer. Such gifts, while not wages, bound courtesans to patrons by networks of favors that could outlast any formal contract. Historians still argue whether these exchanges granted the women lasting security or tethered them precariously to the fortunes of their benefactors. You descend a shallow stairway into a vaulted wine cellar, where rows of amphorae line the walls. On one jar, a hastily scratched note reads, "For the Lady of the Lute, touch not." A fringe account claims courtesans with favoured titles, sometimes claimed entire vintages, distributing select jars to influential guests as tokens of favour. Others argue such markings were simple storage notes without any layered meaning. You chuckle softly, picturing an annoyed steward muttering when someone taps the wrong jar. Joke 2 curls in as you imagine the Lady of the Lute saying, "That's not wine, that's my retirement plan." Returning to the upper floor, you wander through a gallery lined with painted reliefs of household scenes. One panel shows a woman presenting a lotus garland to a reclining noble as musicians play in the background. Some scholars view this as a stylized banquet depiction, while fringe whispers hold that such scenes subtly celebrated patron-courtesan bonds, immortalizing connections that patrons considered worth flaunting. Historians still argue whether these artistic tributes elevated these women socially, or simply marked them as part of a patron's curated image of refinement. In a smaller salon, you find 2 women seated on cushioned benches, speaking in low tones with a middle-aged priest whose hands rest on a scroll. He slides the document across the table, granting them the right to use a section of temple land for cultivating flax, in exchange for their presence at temple banquets during certain festivals. While this agreement benefits them materially, it anchors their lives to obligations they cannot easily refuse. You can almost hear their whispered calculations as they weigh the value of each amphora of oil or bolt of flax against the toll of these appearances. Historians still argue whether arrangements like this empowered women by securing steady income or reinforced dependence disguised as generosity. Through an open window, the faint sound of a reed flute drifts from a distant balcony where a group of priests and visiting Greek traders recline with cups of beer and wine. Among them, a courtesan in a pale blue linen wrap gestures animatedly, her laughter carrying across the courtyard. A fringe rumor suggests women like her sometimes served as informal cultural translators, helping smooth negotiations between Egyptian officials and foreign traders, their presence making discussions feel less rigid. Joke 3 brushes across your thoughts as you imagine her whispering, "I'm charging for the laughter, not the translation," as she hands another cup to a hesitant envoy. As dusk paints the estate walls with hues of rose and copper, you notice a lone figure crossing the tiled walkway, her bracelets catching the fading light. She disappears into a colonnade that leads back toward the city, leaving the faint scent of myrrh in her wake. The villa quiets behind her, its wealth and whispers settling into the night. You step beyond the gate and feel the cooler air off the Nile brush your face. The day's impressions linger. Courtesans bound to patrons by contracts, gifts, and mutual utility, their fortunes as bright or as brittle as the amphorae stacked in those cellars. Tomorrow you will follow them beyond the estates and into the common streets and markets, where they walked unadorned, trading luxury for anonymity in the hum of the city. You leave the estates behind and make your way down a sloping road into the heart of the city, where the hum of daily life replaces the hush of polished courtyards. The smell of fresh bread and goat cheese mingles with the tang of river mud and smoke from cooking fires. Stalls line the streets, their awnings patched with scraps of dyed fabric, and vendors call out prices for figs, linen, and clay pots. In these crowded lanes, courtesans who glittered in villas and festivals move quietly, wrapped in plainer linen, blending with neighbours who share no trace of their evening worlds. You might think they only existed in perfumed halls, but here they are, walking among butchers and basket weavers, bartering like anyone else while keeping a cautious eye on familiar faces. A mainstream historical fact grounds this moment. Ostraca and papyri from Oxyrhynchus record transactions in which women known for entertainment work bought food, firewood, and dye, sometimes pooling with neighbours to reduce costs. These same records show occasional disputes with shopkeepers over inflated prices, proof that their wealth did not always spare them from friction in the marketplace. Historians still argue whether these women moved anonymously through such streets, or drew sidelong glances even in their most modest attire. You pause by a fig vendor's stall, where a woman in a simple ivory-dyed tunic haggles over a basket of ripe fruit. She hands over a clay token stamped with a merchant's mark, a sign she trades regularly enough to earn credit. A fringe whisper suggests tokens like these sometimes bore discreet symbols identifying favoured clients or suppliers, letting courtesans bypass long waits for goods. Others claim they were nothing more than basic promissory markers used by anyone with standing credit. Joke one flickers in your mind as you imagine her handing the token back to the vendor and muttering, "Put it on my tab. I'll charm someone into paying later." Further along, you see two women leaning near a textile stall, examining bolts of linen dyed in muted greens and blues. One runs her fingers along the weave, testing for strength, while the other tucks a handful of leftover threads into a pouch. A fringe theory suggests courtesans collected such remnants not only for mending their wraps, but also for bartering small tokens of favour, weaving them into bracelets for regular patrons. Skeptics argue these threads were merely practical scraps, kept to patch household garments. You grin at the thought of a man treasuring a bracelet of leftover cloth as if it were worth more than silver. As you step past a pottery shop, you notice a low wall covered in chalk drawings and hastily scrawled jokes. One depicts a stick figure dancing beside an amphora, with the caption, "She charges more than the wine but dances longer." Another shows a frog wearing a beaded necklace, an image some believe represents a playful nod to Bees, the household god, tied loosely to these women's lives. Historians still argue whether such graffiti mocked or celebrated their work, though its presence suggests a familiarity that blurred ridicule and recognition. Near the city square, a group of courtesans sit beneath a palm awning, sharing a loaf of barley bread and a clay cup of beer. Their laughter rises above the chatter of fishmongers, but their voices drop when a priest passes by, his eyes narrowing before he disappears into a spice store. A fringe whisper claims some women cultivated discreet ties with sympathetic merchants and scribes to stay ahead of complaints or gossip, ensuring that their names stayed off temple registries when tensions rose. Others believe they simply kept their heads low, relying on each other more than any ally beyond their circle. Joke 2 curls in as you picture one of them raising her cup and whispering, "May the priest buy stale spices today," before laughing softly into her bread. In the corner of the square, a young apprentice carves hieratic symbols into a thin piece of wood, copying a line of verse he overheard from a street singer. The verse praises a woman called the Whisper of Hathor for her voice, not her appearance, which suggests that some courtesans were known in the common quarter more for their artistry than for any scandal. Historians still argue whether such verses were spontaneous tributes or covert advertisements meant to circulate through markets and catch the attention of new patrons. Past the square, a narrow alley leads to a courtyard where laundry lines stretch between mud brick walls. Courtesans' assistants scrub linens in shallow basins, their arms slick with soap made from natron and oil. A fringe account holds that some women secretly rented out laundry services to supplement their income, letting neighbors assume they were simple laundresses rather than household heads of a larger trade. You can almost hear them humming while turning a profit 2 ways at once. Joke 3 stirs as you imagine one of them whispering, "These stains are from wine. The silver will clean just fine," while wringing a tunic. As the sun dips, painting the mud brick walls a deep gold, the streets grow quieter. Vendors roll up their awnings, and the smell of roasted onions drifts from homes preparing their evening meals. Courtesans disappear back into their private quarters, their plain tunics concealing the jeweled combs and scented oils waiting behind their doors. In the quiet, the city feels like 2 worlds folded into one, and you can sense how carefully these women walked between them. The evening breeze brings the faint buzz of flies and the rustle of papyrus leaves as you turn toward the river. Tomorrow you will leave the ordinary streets behind to trace how time itself reshaped these lives, from shifting rulers and edicts to the arrival of new cultures whose laws and appetites altered everything these women had built. You rise with the sun cresting over the palm groves and follow the worn stone road toward the harbour district, where the air carries a tang of salt, fish, and the faint sweetness of pressed figs. Ships with painted prows bob gently against the docks, their sails casting long shadows over the bustling quay. The voices here shift as new cultures stake their presence, their languages mingling like overlapping waves. From Greek to Aramaic to Latin, every tongue seems to reshape how people speak about the women whose lives wind through both the markets and the mansions. You might imagine these shifts simply added more patrons to their world, but in truth, new rulers and laws pulled their work into unfamiliar shapes, sometimes granting freedoms and sometimes shackling them with fresh obligations. A mainstream historical fact grounds your walk. During the Ptolemaic and later Roman periods, official edicts required entertainers and courtesans to register, paying specific levies in exchange for legal recognition and occasional access to magistrates for resolving disputes. These systems sometimes offered protection from harassment, but also made them visible to tax collectors and civic authorities in ways earlier dynasties rarely demanded. Historians still argue whether these measures helped stabilize their livelihoods or made them targets for extortion and tighter control. At the edge of the quay, you watch a tax clerk examine a wooden tablet covered in wax, his stylus scratching as he lists names beside Greek letters and symbols. A fringe whisper suggests some women circumvented these registries by working as household entertainers without formal contracts. letting patrons pay their levies indirectly. Others argue most complied because registration, while costly, shielded them from temple and civic pressures. Joke 1 passes through your thoughts as you imagine a woman sighing, "Pay the fee, avoid the priest, survive the year," while handing over her hard-earned coins. You step into a shaded warehouse where amphorae of oil and grain line the walls, some marked with the names of Roman officials. A scribe adjusts his scroll, noting which allotments are destined for estates and which are recorded as festival allocations, a term that some scholars believe concealed compensation for registered entertainers. Others maintain the phrase merely covered ceremonial expenses. Historians still argue whether these euphemisms allowed women to receive official stipends without open acknowledgement or if they simply reflect bureaucratic ambiguity. Farther down the street, a painted wooden sign hangs above a courtyard gate, its faded Greek inscription reading, "House of Lyres and Laurel." Some believe such signs identified private music schools, while fringe voices suggest they doubled as coded markers for courtesan-managed salons that operated discreetly under the guise of cultural education. You run your fingers along the worn paint, feeling the grooves left by the carver's chisel, and smirk at the thought of a traveller enrolling for music lessons and leaving with far more than scales and chords. Joke 2 slips in as you picture someone bragging later, "I studied the lyre, but I learned the waltz instead," while patting their new bracelet of faience beads. Through a narrow lane you spot a Roman officer leaning against a pillar, watching a courtesan in a crimson wrap speak softly with a merchant from Cyrene. The officer's hand rests on a wax tablet where he notes her name, not as a charge but as a figure tied to a levy. A fringe rumour claims some Roman officials cultivated private networks with favoured courtesans, letting them bypass certain fees in exchange for information about market trends or rival households. Others insist these women avoided entanglements, knowing how quickly such alliances could turn dangerous. Historians still argue whether these relationships tilted toward partnership or exploitation. Near a fountain shaded by sycamores, a cluster of women gather to share news about edicts rumoured to arrive from Alexandria. One murmurs that new taxes will include a surcharge on imported perfumes, another curses that levies on music licenses might double. These whispers reflect how foreign governance turned their livelihoods into shifting equations. Some adapted by seeking wealthier Greek and Roman patrons, while others pulled back, working only within smaller circles to avoid official scrutiny. You follow a winding alley where a sculptor carves small ivory charms shaped like dolphins and shells, items popular among Roman sailors. A fringe detail suggests courtesans gifted these charms to favoured foreign clients as tokens of safe passage, a practice that doubled as subtle advertising among port communities. Others argue they were simply fashionable trinkets with no deeper connection. Joke 3 arises as you imagine a sailor waving a dolphin charm and boasting, "She swore this would bring good luck, but my boat still leaks." As the afternoon wanes, you walk back toward the water's edge, the sun painting the sails and stone facades in hues of orange and gold. These streets echo with the sound of cartwheels, clinking amphorae, and voices haggling in languages that did not fill the air a century before. These women, once framed only by local whispers, now lived within a web of laws, foreign appetites, and shifting economies that could raise or ruin them with a single decree. The tide laps softly against the wooden docks as you turn inland, following the flickering lamplight toward the quieter districts. Tomorrow, your steps will carry you into their final echoes, the tombs, relics, and memorials that speak of how these women were remembered or forgotten when their voices were no longer part of the city's hum. You leave the harbour and follow a winding road past the city's gates, where the bustle of vendors and tax clerks fades into the quiet hum of the desert wind. The smell of wet reeds and faint lotus from the Nile lingers behind you as the air turns dry, carrying only the faint resin of distant tomb chapels. Ahead, limestone cliffs rise in pale layers, their shadows stretching long over the sand. Here, away from the noise of villas and markets, lie the final traces of the women whose lives you have followed, scattered epitaphs, painted fragments, and offerings that whisper how they were remembered, or how others chose to define them when their voices were gone. A mainstream historical fact anchors you in this stillness. Funerary stelae and tomb fragments from sites like Saqqara and Thebes show women linked to music, dance, and companionship, buried with modest yet notable honours, some with inscriptions naming them as Beloved of Hathor or Mistress of Song. These titles echo their social roles while softening the more worldly parts of their lives. Historians still argue whether these epitaphs reflect genuine respect, attempts by patrons to sanctify their memory, or careful phrasing to make their remembrance acceptable to neighbours and priests. You step into a crumbling chapel where a limestone stela leans against a wall, its paint faded but legible. It reads, "May Hathor bless Naneferu, whose laughter soothed the weary and whose offerings lit the temple lamps." A fringe whisper suggests patrons sometimes composed these inscriptions not only as tribute, but to subtly showcase their own piety, tying their names to women whose generosity was now carved in stone. You trace the faint lotus etched beside her name and imagine the dual-purpose honour for her, prestige for those she pleased. Joke once stirs in your thoughts as you picture a wealthy patron muttering, "She gets the blessing, I get the credit," while approving the mason's work. Beyond the chapel, fragments of painted plaster lie in the sand, their colours dulled by centuries of wind. One shard shows a hand strumming a lute, another a garland of blue lotus petals floating beside a cup of wine. Some scholars believe these were pieces of household shrines rather than tomb art, fragments salvaged and placed near burial sites by companions or apprentices. Others argue they were remnants of banquet scenes, repurposed as funerary offerings to echo the joys of life. Historians still debate whether such artifacts represented genuine affection or simply symbolic gestures arranged by surviving patrons. Near the base of a low cliff, you find a clay vessel containing dried petals and 2 faience beads, likely placed as a simple grave offering. A fringe account suggests that courtesans' apprentices often made such offerings themselves, honouring the women who trained them in music, etiquette, and survival. Skeptics say these humble tokens reflect nothing more than custom, no different than the bread or beer left for any common soul. Still, the image of a younger woman kneeling to place those beads lingers in your mind. Further along, a stone slab rests beside a shallow pit, its inscription partially eroded. The surviving lines mention a woman named Tasherit, remembered for her voice of comfort and her hands of grace. There is no mention of patrons or family, only these qualities, suspended without context. Historians still argue whether such omissions were deliberate, an attempt to craft a dignified legacy by shedding any hint of her profession, or if they reflect genuine affection beyond her public life. You climb a narrow path toward a tomb where a faint mural still clings to the wall. 2 women sit beside a pool under a painted palm, their hands joined as one offers the other a lotus flower. Some believe this represents camaraderie, perhaps even a bond between 2 companions beyond their clients. A fringe whisper claims such scenes symbolize partnerships in burial as well as life. suggesting some women chose to be remembered beside their closest allies rather than patrons or relatives. Joke 2 drifts through your mind as you picture a scribe muttering, "No husbands, just 2 friends and a flower," while carefully painting the scene. Inside a shallow chamber, a faint smell of resin clings to the stone. A small wooden box rests near the back, its lid carved with Hathor's face and a pair of tiny smiling BE's figures. Some believe boxes like these held personal tokens, a wig comb, a string of beads, perhaps a rolled scrap of papyrus with a favorite song lyric. Others suspect patrons commissioned them as burial gifts to demonstrate their generosity one last time. Historians still argue whether these keepsakes were true mementos of the women's lives, or props crafted to soothe the living more than the dead. As you step back into the open air, the desert wind brushes against your cloak and carries the faint rustle of papyrus reeds from the river far below. The cliffs glow faintly pink under the sinking sun, their layers catching the last light like the pages of a book slowly closing. These final echoes, etched in limestone, scattered in sand, and left in simple vessels, speak of women who lived lives as layered as the world. They moved through lives of music, luxury, struggle, and resilience, woven into Egypt's history even as the details fade. Joke 3 crosses your mind as you imagine a ghostly bard whispering, "At least the lotus outlasted the gossip," as the sun dips behind the horizon. The desert cools quickly as dusk deepens, and your steps slow along the path back toward the faint torchlight of the city. The wind hums through the cliffs, softer now, like a closing lullaby. You pause once more to take in the view, the Nile glimmering like a thin thread below, before turning back toward the living world where these echoes began. The night settles gently over the desert as you leave the tombs behind, the cool air brushing your face like a calm hand easing the heat from your skin. The Nile's slow murmur carries softly on the wind, mingling with the distant calls of night birds rising from the reeds. The sky deepens to velvet, scattered with stars that glimmer like grains of crushed quartz, each one casting the faintest silver sheen across the sand. You take a slow breath and let the stillness seep into your chest, the sounds of the day receding until only the quiet remains. The path ahead feels soft beneath your feet, the fine grains of sand shifting gently as you walk. Each step seems slower now, your body loosening as the breeze slides past, carrying with it the faint sense of myrrh and lotus still clinging from the tombs. You let your shoulders sink and your breath settle, each inhale smoothing out the edges of thought, each exhale leaving you lighter. Far in the distance, a temple torch flickers, its glow so faint it looks more like a star resting on the earth. You pause for a moment, eyes half closed, letting the steady rhythm of the wind and the muted pulse of the river guide your senses. The world feels hushed, as though it has wrapped itself in a blanket for the night, leaving you to drift quietly in its folds. The last of the day's warmth fades, replaced by a calm coolness that settles across your skin. The sounds, the scents, even the faint glow of distant lights blur together into a gentle haze, until all that remains is stillness, and your body feels ready to drift wherever the quiet night carries you.